Okay, good afternoon. We're going to be getting started. Please mute your mics. We're going to start with first a general disclaimer for this presentation. The information within this presentation is intended to facilitate discussions on various existing and potential regulatory mechanisms. No final decision regarding this information is expressed or implied by the department. Next slide. And with that, I would like to welcome all of you this afternoon. My name is Judith Andraco. I'm the Regulatory Officer for the Site Remediation and Waste Management Program. I'd like to welcome you to the first meeting of our Stakeholder Meeting Series for PL 2019, Chapter 397, affectionately known as the Dirty Dirt Law. I'm your moderator for today's presentation, and I would ask that you please keep your microphones muted throughout the presentation. Next slide. I'd like to discuss a little bit of the Microsoft Teams logistics. We ask that you only use the chat function if you're experiencing technical issues. If you're having issues with your audio, with your video, if you can't see the presentation, something like that. We are not going to be handling any chats or discussions in the chat function today. We'd like to have everyone participate verbally so that we can make sure that everyone is engaged in the main conversation. We would ask that you use the raise your hand function at certain parts of the presentations this afternoon. We're going to have designated times when we're going to have back and forth. We would ask that you raise your hand if you have a comment or a question. After each particular presentation concludes, I'll be selecting the person to speak. When that person is selected to speak, we would ask that you unmute your microphone and lower your hand when you're called upon. In the interest of time, a DEP staff member may interject in the discussion with a cue to keep us on schedule. As of right now, we're scheduled from 1 o'clock until 4. We would like to make sure that we would wrap up discussion points and move on to next presentations so that we can make sure that we cover everything that we set out to do for this particular meeting. Also, we're going to be having poll questions. For those of you that have been through some of our DEP stakeholder meetings before, this might ring familiar. Throughout the presentations, we want to keep track of your opinions because the reason that we're meeting is because we want to know what you think. This will appear as a link, different poll questions will, wherein you'll be directed to a main question sheet. That is what our chat function is going to be used for today. You'll be able to access the poll questions through the links that will be added in that chat. We ask that in your responses, you type your name and affiliation before making any comment within the Q&A, basically to ensure accurate notes. We want to make sure that we know who you are and who you're representing and who you're here for. You can vote by selecting an option at that link and selecting Submit Vote. You can change your vote as many times as you like, but only your final choice will be recorded. Because there's a decent amount of questions that we'd like information from you on, just to make sure that we're learning all of your opinions. Just want to let you know that the poll questions will be open for answering for the next 24 hours. So if you feel like you're a little bit rushed, if you're only given about a minute and you'd like to add more later, you can feel free to click on the link for this meeting, go into the chat function and click on the links for the poll questions, and you'll be right back in the point where you can give us your opinions and thoughts. Next slide. At this time, I would like to introduce our team members who are working on the rulemaking this time around. There's myself from the Assistant Commissioner's Office, Judith Andraco. There's our Rule Manager, Ana Maria Pena Herrera. From our Division of Solid and Hazardous Waste, we have Deputy Director Scott Brubaker, Bureau Chief Seth Hackman, Section Chief Jill Aspinwall, A901 Supervisor Roxanne Fiesel, Environmental Engineer Dan Murray. From our Division of Water Enforcement, we have our Director Mike Hastry, Bureau Chief Bob Gomez, Bureau Chief Tom Farrell, Transportation Oversight Unit Supervisor Lawrence Lewis. And from the Division of Law, we have Deputy Attorneys General Dave Tuason and Jacob Umoke, as well as Investigator and A901 Administrator Steve Hulse. Next slide, please. Now, today we have a few goals for this meeting, and they're relatively simple. We want to hear from you, the industry experts, and our local and county partners and our regulated community on how we can improve our roles. Our experience is that the final product is often far superior if input's received from individuals with diverse perspectives. This is where you all come in. As our moderator, I will provide direction to ensure that all of you present have an opportunity to provide input and comment and to keep us on track. Next slide. This stakeholder process, we're at step one. This is our first meeting. We're going to be meeting more. This stakeholder process will facilitate the development of a regulatory proposal or a rule proposal that will eventually be published in the New Jersey Register. At the time of the New Jersey Register publication, you will then have 60 days for a formal comment period. Within that comment period, we're going to most likely have a public hearing so that you would be able to verbalize your concerns and questions for the department in a formal manner. Throughout that 60-day comment period, you'll provide us your comments on the proposal. After that period in time, we will work on our response to comments, which will then be published as an adoption, a rule adoption within 1 year of the date of proposal. And this is all in conformance with the Administrative Procedures Act. At this point in time, I'd like to introduce Division Director Michael Hastry, who's going to go to a discussion about our frequently asked questions.
How are you, folks? As part of this rule, we well, I'll back up a second here. You know, before we get into the frequently asked questions, and just that all that's about is that when the rule came into play, we were getting a lot of questions on it, so we put together one was a guidance as well as responses to some potential questions that we have, and our interpretation of the law to begin with. And we'll talk about that, some of the specific aspects of that a little later on. But before we get there, I really want to just take a step back and kind of put this rule in perspective with what's going on really in the big picture. And the reality is here for some time, you know, DEP has been struggling with the issues of quality fill being placed and reused throughout the state. You know, the number of complaints we are getting has been increasing dramatically over the last few years. And the last thing we want to do is to create additional remediation sites that have to be addressed just because someone thought they were getting some kind of quality product. And yeah, there's a lot of reasons why there's now a lot of focus and why there's a lot of complaints regarding soil and fill materials. One is just it's much easier to get materials. The solicitation process, I can go on Craigslist, I can go here, I can go wherever, say, you know, I want cheap, I want free fill, and boy, lo and behold, within 3 hours, a dump truck is at your property dropping material. Yeah, there's the financial aspect for misuse. I may be involved in the business, I get hired to remove material from here. Yeah, instead of disposing of it, I say, you know, I can clean this up a little bit, and I'll sell it off as a recyclable material. I can either, you know, let it go for a cheap price, or let it go for free, and I've really made more money. The other aspect is both DEPs and the public's developing knowledge of the contamination issues that these materials can have, and yeah, DEP has been working in that aspect, so we're kind of the victims of our own success with regards to that piece of it. But the reality, this all boils down to a lack of oversight and control regarding these types of materials and the industry in general. So probably for the last 7, 8, 9 years, DEP has been working on this problem. And the reality is we have to ensure, it's our job to ensure that if you're going to have soil, if you're going to reuse soils or recycle soils, or you're going to use fill materials throughout the state, it's incumbent on us to make sure that these materials are not contaminated and or they're not loaded with solid waste and debris and rebar and broken glass and all the things that could be wrong with it. And it follows then that the entities that are involved in handling the materials have the requisite reliability, expertise, and competency. And that reliability, expertise, and competency is really its catchphrase that's in the existing A901 licensing rules, of which this particular rule is amendment to those existing rules. If you can go to the next slide. We got a tremendous amount of help from the State Commission of Investigation regarding our efforts here. And they actually had two separate investigations, one followed the other. They came out with two major reports back in 2017, and the second one came out in 2019. And these reports were really instrumental in helping us point out the concerns to the legislature that prompted this particular amendment, the soil and fill amendments to the 901 rules. We just have some quips from the reports. Unscrupulous operators profit by covertly dumping contaminated soil and construction debris. You can read the rest yourself. Next slide, please. New Jersey lacks the authority to properly oversee elements of its recycling industry. Unscrupulous individuals with criminal records and or ties to organized crime were involved, and they undermine the business interests of legitimate recycling enterprises that are trying to do the right thing. And without a doubt, very true. Rings very true to us. So what that helped us do was to address at least part of our overall picture, which was to address not necessarily the quality of the material, but to address the entities involved in the businesses that deal with these materials. The A901 program, and that A901 was the original assembly bill number, that's what it stands for, A901, is a licensing background regulatory scheme. So before you're allowed to enter or engage in these businesses, and the traditional businesses were hazardous waste and solid waste, this amendment now brings in soil and fill materials. So if you're engaged in the business of soil and fill materials, you will now need a A901 license, and you'll have to go through the background procedures to get to it. And that's really looking at your fitness to be in the industry, and that you have no major disqualifiers, that you have the expertise, reliability, and competency to get into the business. In these amendments, though, since we had to open up the statute, it's not like every day we open up statutes. Particularly this one, which is long-standing. I think the original statute came out in either the early 90s or the late 80s. The legislature actually allowed us to tweak a few items that we had that were not necessarily related just to soil and fill, but to the 901 scheme in general. And we're able to clarify some definitions and do a few other things. And we're going to talk about some of those things later on. But again, they apply to all of the regulatory scheme of the 901 program, not just soil and fill materials. So as I mentioned, if you go to the next slide, please. As I mentioned previously, DEP we've been working on this on many fronts. So, we had already done what we call it's an easy read, plain reading, fill guidance that we put together. That's on our webpage someplace. Identifying, what is clean material, what is not clean, what is solid waste. We put together a model ordinance, a soil and fill ordinance, that we supply to the mayor of every municipality. One of the things that prompted this also was that when the SCI was doing their investigation, they noticed that for municipalities that had these ordinances in place, that the dumping didn't occur as frequently. So, we took a hint from that naturally, and we decided to create a model ordinance which the municipalities could use. And basically it requires that if I'm going to import soil into the municipality, that I have to get a permit for it, but I also have to make sure that the material meets certain specs, particularly in regard to contamination levels and the quality. It's not just ground up construction and demolition debris. That it's cleaner material and it's not contaminated. So we did that. We also put together it was a major initiative called Guard Your Backyard, which actually kind of took the easy read guidance that we had put out and the model ordinance that we had put out, and kind of put it all together into this initiative that we did. We had micro web pages that also went out to all the municipalities, explaining the difficulties that we're all having, identifying the need to ensure that the materials are clean, and methodologies to help to basically have the municipalities help themselves in addressing some of these issues. What we're also doing, and again, this amendments to the 901 is really just part and parcel to the big picture. What we're also considering is, and we're pursuing these additional amendments to the changing the rules. And these don't require opening up the statutes themselves. They're just regulatory changes that we're going to make. And some of them may be to consider putting some kind of quality control, quality assurance mechanism for our recycling centers. Right now, that's very limited. Particularly for construction type materials that are source separated that come into a recycling center, concrete, brick, block. There's some soils mixed in there. Right now, there's no controls as to what has to come in, or what levels of contaminants can come into these facilities, and it follows that there's no controls about what level of contaminants can leave the facilities. And to be fair to the industry, some of the facilities are smart. They have already implemented some kind of controls of their own, to reduce their liability. I'm sure they have customers that say, look, I need fill material here, but I don't need it to be above the standards that's going to be a problem for me. So some of them have been very good at doing this. The reality is, though, we have to make sure that everybody's good at doing this. We're also considering, we have soil blenders and soil manufacturers. They take soil, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, mix it all together, and they have a soil product that they sell. Right now, there's no regulatory requirements on these, at least from the waste perspective. There may be some water requirements. We're potentially considering making soil a regulated recyclable material. Whether it's a Class B or a Class C, depending on how we figure this out. But if we do that, then that brings all of these folks into the regulatory mix. They'd be regulated as some type of recycling center. And at that point, we could also put some kind of quality assurance and quality controls on these facilities. So we're trying to deal with the existing recycling infrastructure. We're also trying to deal with the folks who are on the periphery of the recycling infrastructure. Next slide, please. So that's kind of where we are. I mean, that's kind of the big picture of where we are and what we're doing. Again, this rule is part and parcel. to the overall strategy that we have to address this issue. So with that, I think hopefully I've explained it enough to to give everybody the big picture. So what I want to do now is I'll turn it over to Tom Farrell, who's going to, and we have multiple speakers coming down the line, but for this piece, I want to turn it over to Tom Farrell. Tom Farrell's the Bureau Chief for Solid Waste Enforcement and has been the recipient of most of these complaints regarding soil and fill issues. And believe me, they run the gamut from a little residential household who was dumped on to major facilities that have issues. So Tom's involved in all aspects of it. So yeah, we're going to get a little more heavy into this particular rule, these particular amendments now. So with that, Tom, I want you to take it away and tell everybody all the good news and what we have in store for them.
All right, thank you, Mike. Yeah, so we have been dealing with this for many years, and the advent of this legislation is requiring a lot of nuance that we frankly haven't considered before. So we really, really appreciate your input on this. And I want to reiterate what Judy said. We are not making final decisions here. The FAQ may have come off as if we did, but we needed something in the interim because we were getting so many questions. We really want to formulate the final proposal after considering your input. So unfortunately, the slides I have for you are kind of dull. I don't have any pictures here, so I'm just going to read them off. But I do expect a healthy exchange, and we want to give you some time to have input. So after I give you a few of these definitions, we're going to have some open discussion. And then after the open discussion, we're going to have some poll questions. And then after the poll questions, we'll have some open discussion again. So I think we'll have ample opportunity. We're here till 4 o'clock if we need to be. So the definition of soil and fill recyclable materials, out of the law itself, this is verbatim. It says soil and fill recyclable materials means non-putrescible. Let me get rid of somebody trying to get in the lobby here. Aggregate substitute, including but not limited to, broken or crushed brick, block, concrete, or other similar manufactured materials. Soil or soil that may contain aggregate substitute or other debris or material generated from land clearing, excavation, demolition, or redevelopment activities that would otherwise be managed as a solid waste, and that may be returned to the economic mainstream in the form of raw materials for further processing or for use as fill material. Next slide, please. So what is exempt? So we have in our exemptions Class A facilities, your glass, your paper, your plastic, your metal. The Class B recyclable material, if and only if it's taken to a Class B recyclable facility. So there's a big distinction there. And as Mike said, we're going to try to open up the recycling rules to change the definition of soil and fill to be in concert with the Class B regulations so that we can put the QA/QC requirements on the Class B facilities as well. Beneficial use material, you can find the regulations for that at NJAC 726 1.7G. And other material virgin quarry products like rock, stone, gravel, sand, clay, and other mine products. Next slide, please. So from our FAQs, we are thinking of interpreting the law to exclude from the requirement to obtain a registration and subsequent A901 license for the management of clean. And when we say clean, we're talking about visually clean, because then we follow it by the word uncontaminated. And when we're talking about uncontaminated, we're referring to the definition of solid waste at NJAC 7:26-1.6A6. Those tie into the ingestion dermal and ingestion and inhalation standards, rather, ingestion dermal and the inhalation standards for residential settings. So if you are above those standards, you've triggered the definition of solid waste. Now you may note that this change came into being in September of 2017 but it referred to the direct contact soil remediation standards for residential settings or non-residential settings, whichever were more stringent. In May of 2021, NJAC 7:26D, the remediation standards were revised to use the new terminology of ingestion, dermal, or inhalation, and again for residential settings. But this time we made it so if you pass for residential, you pass for all of them. There's not the, I think there's 8 compounds where the non-res was actually different. It was actually less stringent than the, or more stringent than the residential. But now it's all even. Anything residential, if you're above that, you've triggered the definition for solid waste. Okay, so we have clean, uncontaminated, undisturbed virgin soil that would not otherwise be considered solid waste. This is being thought to be excluded, okay? And also, if the person is claiming this such that is able to demonstrate, provide documentation that such determination was made based on sufficient and appropriate laboratory analysis of and proof of the soil's physical and chemical properties supporting the exclusion. Next slide, please. So business concerns, and this is the FAQs from 2021 continued, business concerns dealing with excluded materials are and will be required to maintain proof that any soils or soil mixtures they haul or manage meet these criteria and do not contain concentrations of one or more contaminants that exceed the soil remediation standards or the inhalation exposure pathway and the ingestion dermal exposure pathway as set forth in the remediation standards, and that's for the residential setting. Okay. Next slide. All right, Judy, I'm going to push it off to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Right now, we just have a little extra refresher. We want to make sure that we have a back and forth with all of you and we get to hear your thoughts. Just as a reminder, please raise your hand and wait to be called upon. Please remain muted until you're called upon. And please do not use the chat function for any comments. That is for technical questions and technical issues with Microsoft Teams only. Tom, let's move back to you and start with the questions that we're going to discuss.
Sure, next slide, please. Should NJDP include an exemption for businesses that deal with de minimis quantities? If so, what should be the parameters for this exemption? We'd love to hear from you. I see there's a hand up already. So Judy, I'll let you take care of the hands.
All right, you got it. First up is Roger Ferguson. Roger, please unmute yourself and put your hand down and start talking.
I think I can do all of that at once. Hi, Tom. Question for Mike, actually, came up in the earlier presentation. You made a statement that you don't want any additional remediation sites. Why is that?
Well, if we have a site that has no issues and we bring material on there that now causes that site to have to be remediated, we're not doing our job. I mean, the idea is to protect what's clean. We don't want to make things worse.
Okay.
We have enough work with sites that are already impacted. We don't want to create additional impacted sites.
So you're looking at the much more broader perspective, not saying you don't want to give site remediation more cases as opposed to solid waste enforcement having the case.
Absolutely.
Okay. So question for Tom. Is alternative fill material on a site remediation site given the same exemption as a beneficial use material?
So I believe that question was addressed in the 2021 update of the soil and fill recyclable materials. In my recollection, but you'd have to check that to be sure, is that and I don't know that we have anybody from site remediation on the line here. But
it was in the guidance. I'm on the committee, Tom.
Okay. Right. So it will be consistent with the guidance.
Okay. You're okay. I just, for all the other 80 people on the group, for them to consider that. And
I mean, this is my understanding, is that we'll try to be as consistent with the guidance as possible. If there's a nuance that maybe those who put the guidance together didn't consider with respect to this law. We may have to address it, but we're looking at all possibilities, and we don't know exactly how we're going to end up at this point.
I don't want to speak for solid waste and what they wanted put in, but I believe it was consistent with the regulations, not the statute. So, okay. Last question. I'll turn my mic off. Are you proposing to include the new migration to groundwater soil remediation standards in what is defined as clean?
So I'll take that. So right now we're focused on the definition of solid waste.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, that definition does not include the migration to groundwater standards.
Correct. Is that something that's on the table to change that definition?
Well, I think everything is on the table. So I really can't give you a yes or no on that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Next up is Wolfgang Skasel. I'm not sure if I pronounced your last name right.
Yes, you did.
Awesome.
I just don't know how to lower my hand at this point.
That's okay.
All right. So looking at the first question, I would wonder if it would be DEP's intent to bring in like a landscaping company, for example, somebody that might have relatively small quantities of topsoil, available, in bulk. Would that be the intention of DEP? I would venture to guess that, if a landscaping company had the ability to provide like a source for the material and maybe receive the certification from their source that it was clean, that met the definition of what was clean, that would be acceptable. The other thing that I wonder about, for example, in my own town, the town will produce topsoil for residents. I can go to my DPW yard and pick up, topsoil in bulk. Are they now subject to this requirement? Will they also have to have certifications to show that their topsoil is uncontaminated?
Yeah. So Wolf, you asked some very pertinent questions, which we are considering, and hence the caption on this slide, should we have a de minimis? We recognize the universe of soil is incredibly large, and the main focus of the SCI report was for illegal dumping of construction and demolition materials, typically coming from New York or Philadelphia. And, we were looking at, how would we focus on the major problem without bringing in the little guy that, deals with just a few cubic yards here and there of topsoil. So that's really the basis for this question. Is there a way we can just ferret out the smaller operator, and how would we do that? So we're not going to give you answers today. I'm sorry if you don't look very satisfied, Wolf, but we're asking questions, and we want to hear your questions.
And we'd like to hear your ideas on some of the answers, because we found that when we meet with you and you're dealing with this basically as the boots on the ground, there are other issues that come up that we might not know of. And what we'd like to know is your perspective on how we can make the whole thing a little bit better and easier to use.
Unfortunately, I have a little bit too much experience with this. I've worked there and dealt with it as well.
We have not forgotten.
Yeah, some of them you're probably still dealing with.
All right. Do you have anything further?
No.
All right. Thank you very much. Next up, we have Neil Rivers. Hi, Neil. Neil, you need to unmute yourself. There you go.
2 years later, and I'll get this eventually. Thanks, everyone. I really do appreciate the department's willingness to reach out and to listen to the regulated community on this, and I look forward to continued involvement. In answer to the question, I do think that there ought to be a de minimis quantity exemption of some kind, and I know that the department during the site remediation advisory group meeting had representatives, some of which are on this call, talk a little bit about that, right? The idea that managing and literally trying to license every pool contractor, landscaper, et cetera, could be a significant effort. And in the frequently asked questions, I think the department provided some sense of quantities that might be a good working start. I would just add that, and I mentioned this at the SHRAG meeting, I would just add that there are engineering companies who are involved in investigations, geotechnical investigations of sites, due diligence investigations of sites, where small quantities of soil waste are generated. They're drill cuttings. Often they're just stored in drums and ultimately disposed of, but not always. In drum quantities might go to a roll-off or something like that. And I would think that those smaller types of waste quantities ought to also be provided with such a similar exemption. And just to add, I think the reason that I feel like those engineering companies, and I represent one, Langen Engineering, get themselves potentially into the licensing world in this very small quantity setting, is the idea of brokering as it's defined under the legislation. We may do that due diligence project for a client, and as part of the project have a A901 licensed firm come in and remove 7, 8, 10 drums from a site for proper disposal. But because that contractor comes through our invoice, we read that definition as us being a broker. And so I think what I'm looking to try to set aside is, in these de minimis quantity situations, that the engineer is not a broker. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, you'll see that very question on one of the poll questions, so you'll have an opportunity to weigh in there.
We know how to answer. Thank you very much.
Neil, thank you for your insights. Next, we have Doug Urban.
Good afternoon.
Hi, Doug. How are you?
All right, very good, thank you. One of my questions here is your de minimis quantities. Do you have any idea at this present time on what de minimis you're going to classify this? And the reason why I'm asking this is I currently run a landscape and construction supply yard here, and we actually do process various different types of material. One of them happens to be topsoil. We do a large amount throughout the course of the year of 1, 2, 3, 4 yard type quantities, as well as larger quantities as well too. So my question here is how are you going to require somebody to be able to control this, or what kind of stipulations are you going to do with this as far as telling a homeowner that if you need to get material, you need to call so and so because they have material that's been tested for environmental situations or concerns, I should say. I was just kind of curious to see how you were going to regulate what we're going to do with this.
Right. So we don't know how we're going to regulate it, and that's part of this process we're going through right now, seeking your input. So we certainly have ideas, but I expect that we'll all consider your ideas as well in order to formulate the final idea. and put it out there formally so that people can formally comment on it through the Administrative Procedures Act. But I understand your business concern, but if it's any solace, I don't know if it is or not, but whatever requirements end up being put out there, your competitors will have the same requirements. And then it's up to enforcement to ensure that people are following the requirements. Otherwise, they're subject to fine. So,
All right.
so
well,
yes, the bottom line is the price of topsoil is probably going to go up. We recognize that's a possibility depending on how all the rules shake out. We don't know how they're going to shake out yet.
Correct. I mean,
And Doug, this is Mike Hastry, and I'm wondering if you could help us. I don't know if you're typical of people in your industry, but what is the source of your material to begin with? Because that kind of plays into our thought process. So how do you generate your material? What is the initial sources that you use to generate your soils and your materials?
well, first off, we bring in soils from different construction sites, okay, that have excess material on site. And before we accept it in here, part of the protocol here is that I want to see environmental paperwork on this material before anything is brought in here. Just so I know that I'm not receiving contaminated material in here, and then I have a problem with what do I do with it after the fact. All our soil, I get tested on a yearly basis just to make sure that it does pass all the environmental concerns. I mean, I do supply a lot of the different types of environmental companies with material all the time for, small quantities, sometimes 50, 100, 500, 1,000 yards. In other words, for them doing a remediation project. So for me to bring in contaminated material, it just doesn't help me out at all. I mean, so it's these are some of the things that I make sure that what comes in here is clean, so that I, can turn around and also sell it as clean material as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Doug. Do you have
Great.
anything further at this
No,
time?
I do not. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Next up is Tracy Straka. Hi, Tracy. How are you doing this afternoon?
Doing well. Thank you for doing this. Everybody on this call and the industry as a whole, I'm sure we all really appreciate your efforts to try and hear us out before just unilaterally doing things. To answer the question, yes, I do believe there should be some sort of a de minimis quantity. One of the things also that concerns me is in the proposed de minimis, you tied it to a size of the truck. And I don't think that should matter. Some people are small businesses and only own one type of truck. And whether they put the de minimis quantity or under it, even if it's in a bigger truck, it shouldn't matter. So I think that's a low-hanging fruit that can easily be addressed. And then following up on what Neil Rivers said about the de minimis quantities and generating drill cuttings and other such things, I guess the bigger question that I have is if you don't own trucks, if you're going to appropriate facilities or you're purchasing from the appropriate material suppliers, just to do that as part of a larger contract, why should you need a 901 to hire all of the 901s? And I'm still wrestling trying to get my arms around that, and I haven't heard what the thought process is, because on a construction site, you have subs and then you have subs to subs, and you could be forcing 3, 4, 5 entities that don't own trucks, don't own disposal facilities, don't own fill sources to go out and go through this whole licensing process just to finish a project.
Yeah, those are some good comments. I believe the concern with the capacity of the truck versus what's inside the truck is an enforcement facilitation issue, where if staff is driving along and they see a certain size truck, they don't really need to be concerned with how much of that is filled with material. So it's just an enforceability question. I think that's why that went that way. Whether it stays that way, of course, I don't know. with regard to the multitude of contracts, it definitely requires more thought for us, I think. We talked a lot about it, but, I think if you wouldn't mind writing us a letter with your concerns, laying out some scenarios, I think that could be very helpful.
Okay, which entity would you like it addressed to, or just go to this general website?
Actually, there's an email address we can give you at the end. If you can just send it to there, that would be very helpful. You're muted, Judy.
Good grief, too many buttons. Tracy, just to let you know, that address is, wow, Anna just put it in the chat for us, and it's soilandfill@dep.nj.gov. So you can either copy it from the chat or wait until the last slide and see it again there. Tracy, do you have anything else for us this morning on this afternoon on this point?
Not on this particular topic. We'll see what the other slides are, but thank you.
All right, thanks so much. Next is Shannon Burke from the Ocean County Health Department.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Just a question. We do enforcement on some of these complaints, smaller residential buildings where there may be soil piles. One of the sources that I hear often is from pool companies. They go to dig out a pool. That's where the soil comes from. It doesn't seem like that's the type of soil that we're trying to regulate here. But in discussing like a de minimis quantity, I've heard like 20 cubic yards thrown around, but I'm pretty sure like a built-in swimming pool is going to be more than 20 cubic yards of dirt coming out of, residential property. So I don't know if we could maybe go based on something sort of like that, where what the average swimming pool would be, as far as how you would decide on a de minimis quantity. I feel like a swimming pool sized amount would be reasonable. I don't know.
Well, you bring up an interesting thought. I suppose it may be feasible. We'd have to explore it to have certain categories. For example, swimming pool demolition, here's your de minimis. Building destruction, here's your de minimis, that kind of thing, because there are different concerns for those different sources. We have not really considered that, and I think we should talk about it more. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shannon. Next is Pauline Young. Hi, Pauline. How are you?
Hi. Am I off? There we go. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, and we can actually see you. So hi.
Okay. Awesome. Okay, so just to give you a sort of background, I'm an attorney. I help a lot of companies with their A901 applications. I know a lot of names and faces today, so that's nice. So I was sort of thinking of, just from an enforcement standpoint, how would an enforcement agent determine if they were pulling over a truck that had a de minimis quantity, or otherwise, if you were thinking of, I almost think you have to look at de minimis on a long-term basis. So it might have to be like a yearly basis, like I move this tonnage per year. And then the question, I guess, is, well, I pulled over this guy, he doesn't have an A901, but am I still here? Am I frozen?
We hear you.
Okay. You're still good.
There's no way to determine, he could say, this is the only one I've done all year, so it shouldn't be held against me, that kind of thing. So I was sort of thinking on the same lines of like a self-generator registration. Now, obviously, it may or may not be self-generated, so it might not be the same definition, but sort of that kind of short registration process, as opposed to, the 30 pages of A901, a shorter registration process where you get almost like a de minimis decal for your vehicles, and then perhaps do just a very simple yearly, this is my gross tonnage, so I'm still under the exemption. That was sort of my thought process for it.
So kind of like a mini route, depending
exactly.
on the volume.
Right, something to make it faster and easier to get some compliance, so that you know these people are out there and you know that they're hauling some sort of soil and fill, but they don't need to go necessarily through the whole process. So they stay on your radar. And if, you know, one year they jump over the, you know, de minimis, then you can say, hey, okay, guys, you got to get back on, you got to do the full A901. I don't know. It seems like some decal or something to get them, you know, to keep them recording what their tonnage is. Because otherwise, you know, there's no registration for decals. There's no CPCN. They may not be keeping track of, I'm thinking again, small businesses aren't really keeping track of their tonnage if they're not required to.
So you're looking for like a similar registration system, but like a mini A901
Yes.
type of process, where
Right.
there'd still be that recording and that tracking, but maybe not as extensive
Right.
because it's a smaller volume. Is that
Exactly
where you're
right.
going?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's sort of what I'm thinking. I'm just, you know, the A901 process is, you know, exceeding a year now so I'd like to, you know, fast track some people if you can for, you know, small amounts.
That's an interesting idea. Thank you for that.
Sure.
And please, if you'd like to write down your ideas, please email us to thesoilandfill@dep.nj.gov.
All right, you got it.
All right. Next up, we have Bill Roberts. Hi, Bill. How are you?
There you go. Hi.
There you.
Yeah. The exemption for de minimis quantities, and I take it you're talking about strictly the A901 license, or are you talking about everything else downstream, including the testing and analyticals and that kind of stuff? In other words, would somebody who's generating a few drums of material at a homeowner site want to bring it into a regulated facility, they would be exempt from the A901, but they would not be exempt from the analytical requirements on that material, would they?
So this is a point of discussion that hasn't been finalized yet. What do you think?
Well, being in the regulated community, whether it be a Class B or a beneficial use site, we require that all material coming in be subject to analysis. We do have small quantity generator. Say there's 50 tons coming from a swimming pool job, it would be subject to a lot less analytical work than something coming from an industrial site, but it still would be required to be tested. So I think that you know, that idea that it's de minimis and therefore exempt could still be subject to cheating, I guess you might want to call it. I say the things that that the dirty dirt law is trying to stop. And I am also very much in favor of a de minimis ruling, but the devil's going to be in the details, which I'm sure you're looking at, Mike.
The devil is always there.
Yeah. Well, we believe that basically anything that gets excavated should be sampled and analyzed after the fact, after excavation, not just based on what was sampled in the ground, because there's a lot of cases where it's not the same kind of material, depending on how they excavate, how they've gridded the material out, somebody's scheduling trucks. There's a lot of room for error. And so we believe that everything should be tested prior to being placed, whether it be processed or unprocessed. So I think that the testing has to be there. So unfortunately, that's what I believe.
Good points.
All right. Thank you very much, Bill.
Yeah.
Next up is David Morris. Hi, David. How are you doing today?
Very good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Oh, excuse me on that. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, thanks very much for obviously doing this and presenting this forum. Just to keep it tight, yes, my answer to providing a de minimis quantity exemption would be yes. You know, we do understand how getting the municipalities to self-regulate and self-deputize and regulating the container in which things are moved is very critical. You know, it intervenes at critical aspects It's very carefully crafted. It's kind of like a recent state law that people find creative and objectionable, that's hitting the news headlines. But I would just mention how I was told the A153 bill for the DEP, having authority to establish this model ordinance for soil and fill material has yet to be authorized. So it was always raised an eyebrow that it had been released and established before it had actually been got through the Assembly and Senate. But anyway, a couple of points. The fill guidance is applicable to remediation sites, and only, and it says it in the front, but everyone has been informally expanding it. With what we're talking about here and the linkage of the definition, the guidance does have testing embedded in it and inherent with it. So, I would suggest that, along with this careful de minimis quantity exemption carve out, really, what would we do about a limited or abridged testing requirement? Or would there be a presumption of clean if it's de minimis quantity exemptions, like Doug's retail yards that he mentioned earlier? I'm not sure about whether I agree for a blanket municipal exemption or presumption of cleanliness for material. I have professional skepticism on that point. I can see if you can take a lot of material from a municipal source and it tests bad later, then there's going to be some heartache. But using engines as an attachment point, I understand like death by 1,000 cuts. You can have many small bad loads representing like a chronic exposure or a chronic spread. But be careful regulating all these small lawnmowers, not cars or larger, issues. The larger quantities being very acute issues that do hit the headlines. So the last things I would say is possibly there should be more than two categories. It shouldn't just be de minimis and fully regulated. Maybe there's an interim kind of a statement, because it really comes down to, for me, like how do you prove and test and certify that something is possibly clean? And lastly, I would just say, I would maybe make a suggestion that exclude drum materials. Mass quantities of dirty, unregulated dirt are not being made into mountains in 208-liter aliquots. Thank you.
Thank you. That was good. You're muted, Judy.
I've got to stop doing that. Next up is Michelle Zelezzi. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yes, you did a perfect job. Thank you so much.
Awesome. How are you?
Very good. How are you today? And thank
I'm
you,
well,
Mr.
thanks.
Morris. That was fantastic. So for those of you who don't know me, I actually have been in the environmental industry for a long time, and I'm the general manager of Pure Soil, which is a materials management company, which owns a Class B facility, a permitted Class B facility. And also I do a lot of work. I have worked with the department in model ordinance and things like that. So most of us here have worked with you previously. So for simplicity, to answer your question, yes, I think that there should be a de minimis quantity. I think that a bunch of us in the industry have spoken in some of, like, whether it's Commerce and Industry or UTCA or the Filters Association. We kind of came up with a very simple, just to put numbers out there, designation of 100 cubic yards, which typically equates to 150 tons, give or take, or maybe one given source. Now realize that everybody's getting into the details. The 10,000 Q2 is also.
Your audio keeps going in and out a little bit. I'm sorry.
For those in the industry that are doing work. We're also talking on a municipal level where you may have owners or things like a company like that, just individuals that are looking to, move material or do a home project and things like that. So I don't think it's necessarily intent, but realize that when you start to focus too broadly.
Michelle, your audio keeps going in and out a little bit.
Oh no, I apologize. So I'm not sure where you kind of stopped that or where I broke up, and I apologize for the bad connection. But just simply overall, I think that there should be a number. I think a bunch of us in the industry had kind of commented on 100 cubic yards typically from one particular source. Realize that more often than not, there are some projects that are from homeowners and municipalities, things like that. So there may not be a need to do some significant sampling or things like that. I think that best professional judgment should be used as well. But if we ask the simple question, do we think there should be minimus quantity? I would say yes, and I would throw out there 100 cubic yards.
Okay, 100 cubic yards. Got it. All right, thank you very much. Next we have Robert Lippincott. Hi, Robert, how are you?
Hello, how is everyone today?
As well as can be expected.
I know you can't all answer, but I'm sure everybody's doing fine. Thank you so much for doing this. It's a great way to provide input and share information, and I appreciate it. Just some people gave background. I'll give a quick background. I'm full disclosure. So I've been in this industry for almost 34 years in New Jersey, doing site remediation primarily, but I focused on hazardous waste disposal, hazardous waste, and waste disposal in general. And I've got a PhD from NJIT in Rutgers, and I am on the Science Advisory Board for 10 years, working on different statewide issues for the Commissioner's Office. I think there's a lot to talk about here. I don't want to get off topic, and I want to be very quick. So I just want to mention to answer the question, yes, I do agree that there should be some de minimis quantities identified, and from the different comments that I've heard, I would say I'm not sure that they would tie necessarily just to the volume of material. It would be more where it's from. And I think that there are some examples that we have. I feel in some ways like I'm reliving history with RCRA and some of the issues that we went through with the solid and hazardous waste amendments and the having to define the environmental media rule and the contained in policy and some of these things to get around some of the unintended consequences that the regulation made and impacted remediation as a result. And so I think that those are considerations and some of that history is, I think, valuable to understand how we might want to look at this. For one thing, generator knowledge and the expense of sampling that was considered as part of RCRA. And that's why you don't have to sample for every ounce of material or every batch of material. You can understand your material from a source. And so a residential property without development, for instance, is a source definition. And so I think that versus an industrial site, I think some of you have indicated those types of differences. I think that's important, I think, to consider in the mix as well as de minimis. I think overall de minimis quantities are a good idea across the boards, considering also the intent of this law in the first place. I don't think that I think we want to be cautious about trying to turn it into regulating every ounce of material from every site. I don't think that's the intent of the law. The other thing I would say is that there's a difference between the right now we're prospectively thinking about future regulations, and then there's the retrospective, and right now we have, or at least the interim, I should say, and right now we have interim Q&A answers that seem to me to be focused on some relatively minor issues, and it is a little unsettling for us in the engineering and sciences and consulting business. One of the Q&A answers regards an engineer with rock cores, and we'd be subject. I think, to me, I know we're talking about prospective rulemaking, but maybe the interim guidance can consider these de minimis issues a little more carefully, because I'm not sure that's really the issue in the state. Rock cores from an investigation site. I mean, I just think that's pretty granular for the rule and for the intent. So I think in general the idea would be that while we're talking about future, the interim conditions, and especially since the department is moving ahead with apparently with enforcement under the law before rules come out, that maybe these Q&A answers can consider these de minimis issues a little more carefully, because the rulemaking will take some time. Finally, I would just say there was a comment earlier about engineers being brokers. I think maybe we'll tackle that question here in a little while, but I don't interpret it the way the rule, the statute defines it as written, as being that. I'm not sure that was the intent. So I'd like to hear and hopefully discuss that a little bit more. Thank you.
All right, Robert, thank you very much. Next is Caleb Yanho. Is that the proper pronunciation? If it's not, please correct me.
Janho.
Janho. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So we work in the soil and topsoil blending industry, move fill dirt around the state of New Jersey, produce and sell topsoil. So one of the questions that we had is the intention of this to shift the assumption that all dirt is clean into something where all dirt is dirty and has to be proven clean? I know it's not really an answer time, but it seems like it's going that way, and that kind of shapes how everything else will be viewed going forward as the different rules are being made.
Mike, do you want to take that one, or I can jump in if you'd rather?
No, and there's a few components to that, because understand that this particular rule doesn't necessarily deal with this amendment doesn't necessarily deal with particular material. It's dealing with entities engaged in these businesses. So if you are engaged, if you recycle, reuse this material, if I sell it, if I broker it, if I transport it, if I process it, if I do all of these things, or any one of them, theoretically, this law applies to me. It's a very expansive rule. And it has some limitations based on the definition of the material. But that's not where we're really going to ultimately clean up and make sure that soil and fills materials meet all of the standards. So it's difficult to try and have this one rule accomplish all of those things. So it's different pieces. This is just a piece of the big puzzle. But the premise here really is that it's not really looking at whether the material is clean, it's dirty. I mean, if the material was a solid waste to begin with, this rule doesn't really apply, because the existing solid waste 901 requirements apply. If you were handling solid waste material, you need a solid waste 901 license. If you are, and this rule is geared to recycling of the material. So if I'm recycling this material, I need this license. Doesn't really talk about contamination per se. Yeah, that's what we ultimately have to define. But you know, we're trying to bring in the expansiveness of this rule. So don't get too caught up with regards to, well, is the material clean? Is it uncontaminated? Is it below residential? Is it above? Is it above commercial industrial standards? That's not really the focus here. The focus is I am in the recycling business in some form or another, and I deal with soils and I deal with fill material. If I'm a small entity, do I really need to go through this whole background process? That's what this rule is, and it's difficult not to go down that rabbit hole and say, oh, it's clean, it's not clean, it's this, it's that, it's this. But that's not what this rule was really designed for. This rule is designed for, if you're in this type of business, you're in. We're trying to figure out who should be out.
So it's more geared towards regulating the entities themselves than taking care of dirty dirt per se.
Absolutely.
Okay, so because you could have a trucker that just gets hired to move dirt around the state, which I know in North Jersey was a major issue, and they just dumped it somewhere. There probably wasn't anybody who would qualify under what I'm now understanding was the intention of handling material, because nobody recycled it. It got taken somewhere, it just got dumped. That made a huge issue for a lot of people. Nobody took it in, recycled it, and then shipped it out, which I feel like, just being in the industry, is where most of the dirty material that doesn't actually go where it should gets handled. So does it really accomplish helping to clean up the state or stop dirty material from moving around if it's not really about the dirt, it's more about the entities?
Yes.
All right, Caleb, do you have anything further at this point?
Yeah, I guess on the de minimis quantities, if there is a de minimis quantity that's carved out and you have these soil recyclers, dirt recyclers who are taking material in, and they handle 1,000 yards at a time. Let's say you say anything under 100 doesn't need to be tested. Why would the recycler want to take that risk now of taking in untested material when everything else that they take in is tested? Is that going to start pushing these smaller quantities out into small markets? It could be farms, it could be small mom and pop places. And then that material starting to get moved around with no regulation, nobody's keeping an eye on it. I guess that would be my concern, where that de minimis is set. But we also don't want to be overbearing on a pool contractor. What is that pool contractor digging in Hunterdon County, or are they digging in Jersey City? Your risk is very different between those two, but if it's a flat blanket rule, you may be missing a lot.
Well, what if we were to do something like that? What kind of documentation do you think would help to, if we were to be able to make a difference between your Hunterdon versus your Camden? What information do you think would be defining in a separation of different kinds of material from based upon location? Like, basically, what kind of paperwork or record keeping do you think would work to help delineate that?
Well, the answer to that's going to be built on the answer to the first question. So if you don't have a soil recycler that's in the loop there, then it's just an excavator and a pool company and wherever they're taking it. So whatever we set doesn't matter if none of them are held to this new A901 or whatever it gets turned into in its final state. None of them are required to have any of this. So,
well, what information would you want to have from them?
There'd have to be a testing criteria set. I don't know if it's a sliding scale like the clean fill guidance is, but you'd have to go back to pretty much presuming all material over a certain quantity is contaminated. You have to show me that it's not. Test it at a certain quantity, tests per cubic yards, and then they would have to present that documentation, which is going to become really, I don't want to say overbearing, but it's a big layer to put on top of most of these smaller guys that every source is a small quantity coming out. Somebody might do 500 pools in a year. Well, there might be 50 cubic yards per pool. Still a lot of material, but how is that set? So I guess, well, it's hard to give that answer. Well, this is still in the formulation prospect, because it gets really over. If you tell somebody one test per load, that's a lot of money if you're only taking out 3 or 4 loads for a pool. But if you're taking 1,000 loads off a job site now, that's more than it's going to cost to get rid of the dirt. And it's a tough answer without understanding the premise of we're not really regulating dirt here, we're regulating the entities.
Right, but if you're excluded, question 11 of the frequently asked questions, it states that business concerns dealing with excluded materials are and will be required to maintain proof that any soils or soil mixtures they had or managed meet the criteria and do not contain concentrations of one or more contaminants that exceed the soil remediation standards, blah, blah, blah. So, right now, at least with the FAQs out there, we're cognizant of the need to have some proofs out there. So how we define that in regulation is what we're trying to come up with.
And if you have any particular ideas on what you think some of that information might be, Even if you go down to a really granular level, please email us that information, because we'd love to know your viewpoint on it, because that gives us more to consider. And it gives us more information to think about to see what would work better in the regulated community while we also protect the environment. Do you have anything further on this point?
Nope, that's all. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. And next we have Anthony Russo. Hi, Anthony, how are you?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Before I share my views with the de minimis, just a question for, I guess, Mike and Tom and you, Judy. How many registrations did the department receive? Does anybody have an idea of what the universe is?
Actually, I was going to toss to either Mike or Anna.
Roxanne might know.
Hi, this is Anna. So we received a little bit over 700 registrations.
Okay. Just a question, and then I'll get into the de minimis views. But I got a couple of calls last week from a couple of members that were late to the registration process, and they were wondering if they submitted their registrations now, you know, would there be any consequences? How's the department going to treat it? Is the window still open to submit a registration?
So the registration period is over for the soil and fill registration application. That document was posted on our website. However, it was taken down because the deadline had reached up until the October 14th period. So people who are engaged in the soil and fill industry are no longer able to apply for the soil and fill registration. So at that point, they would have to determine whether or not an A901 license is applicable to them.
Okay, so as far as they can't submit the registration, I guess is what you're saying.
Correct.
So, but they should also be aware there's a grace period. I think it's January 14th, as of January 14th of 2022, they cannot continue that business without the A901. So, you know, they have some work to do.
And that was another question that I had, because looking at the FAQs, it basically says, yeah, come the middle of January, you need to either have the A901 or the registration. So if they missed the registration deadline, they wouldn't be able to operate, correct?
They would have to subcontract to an A901 transporter or processor or whatever, broker or whatever they're doing. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah.
I guess on the de minimis side, and needless to say, this is, and maybe I could speak for most of the association reps on here. I know from CIA&J's perspective, this has been an issue that definitely caught a lot of people's attention. A few of our members are landscapers, and one of the things that we went through is that 100 cubic yards number that's in the FAQs. I know a lot of them would be comfortable with 200. So for whatever that's worth, I mean, that's not to say that all of them would be happy with 200, but that's just some feedback from me. But yeah, this is
Anthony. What would be the basis for the 200? This is just Judy asking.
You know what, Judy? I don't know if other landscapers are on the call right now, but I can deal with Gail Wolcott, who runs the New Jersey Landscape Contractors Association. Mm-hmm. So she's not on your stakeholder list. She should be. Okay. It comes from her, and I could follow up with her to get more specifics on that. But again, when we were going through the FAQs, that was one of the things that she brought up, is if we could increase it to 200.
Good to know.
Right. So, Anthony, if you have more than one member with that opinion, that would be helpful. There's always going to be outliers that we can't make everybody happy, but, you know, if there's a consensus of a bunch of people that feel that way, that would have, I would think, more sway in our consideration.
No, I appreciate that, and I'll definitely share that with you. Also, you should know, too, again, that there's still a lot of confusion out there with this whole issue, and again, full transparency here. You're probably aware, and I don't know if Mark Peterson is on, but I did speak with the commissioner. But I did engage Senator Smith to try to maybe do a couple of amendments to clean up who's going to be subject to this. And I know that kind of runs on a parallel front here from what the stakeholder process, but I just wanted to make you guys aware that whether we can get it done through lame duck or maybe as soon as the new legislature is sworn in. I know Senator Smith is, you know, anxious to kind of help clear up a lot of things here. Because again, we're talking about de minimis, and I'm sure you're going to cover some other things later on, but, you know, everything from due diligence to attorneys, engineers, you know, companies that really don't get that involved in the whole term with broker, consultant. So it's created a lot of confusion. I think what you're going to see happening is people, submitting information that maybe they're not subject to the requirements. So that's why I wanted to get a sense of, 700 does not seem like a lot. I don't know if the department has an opinion on that. I mean, that doesn't seem like a lot of registrations, but I don't know, again, what you guys think.
All right. Thank you for your points. It's very helpful. Do you have anything further right now?
No, I just, again, I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to working with everybody on it.
Sure. Same here. Next up, Neil, welcome back. Neil Rivers.
Thank you, and I promise to keep this quick, but Robert Lippincott's comments caused me to just want to clarify a couple of things. And really, Mike Hastry, I think you did it for me, but I just want to reemphasize my concern, and I am not a lawyer, don't want to practice law, but in attorneys, we had to look at the legislation. The definition of broker is broad. In my experience with the department in the past, and I think during recent discussions I have heard, essentially, if you are in the money trail, you could be subject to these rules, these requirements, and by that I mean, in my case, that I used earlier, several drums of drill cuttings, perhaps, that I hire a A901 licensed contractor to remove on behalf of my client, whether I mark their charge up, whether I make a profit on that or not. If that bill flows through me, the interpretation is that our firm is being a broker, and so that's why I think the idea behind a de minimis quantity exemption for these very small cases makes great sense. That's all I had. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Neil. Next, we have David Morris. David, welcome back.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry about that. I didn't introduce myself before. Obviously, I work for Tectonic Engineering, and I'm a trustee of the LSRP Association. In a prior lifetime, I used to work for a larger entity engaged in soil and fill. So it's really interesting to hear this. Look, for me, I'm very concerned about the practicalities of doing this. Whereas what I'm hearing from regulators, it's about following the larger loads, following the revenue, and where people do harm in acres rather than cubic feet. For me, the way that I suppose that I'm hearing now, a question, is this driven by the emphasis on significant quantities? And I would say, no, it isn't, not yet. And it's also, is this focused on test levels then? And no, not really. From what I'm hearing, we're looking to de-emphasize that. So really, it's an emphasis on people based upon what they do and how much they move. So how can we de-emphasize the testing and make it a little easier? I would propose maybe to focus on the capture of the business units by these material quantities, for it's the big quantities that are the primary concerns that we know about. Why don't we change the focus? And maybe while we can look at excluding the little fish, but maybe looking towards how do you capture the biggest ones, the biggest quantities, because those are the things that have created the headlines and the kind of the unlicensed landfills that have happened, and also I see there's this long, shallow but slippery slope about starting to track all loads of soil around the state, which would be another unintended, inadvertent consequence, which would have far-reaching issues. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. We appreciate your input. Next, Caleb, welcome back. Caleb Janho.
Just had one more quick follow-up. When it came to landscapers came up and buying material, if they're not in the recycling business, they're not doing the recycling. So where did they fit into this as far as being regulated at all? If they're buying a finished product like topsoil.
I was going to toss to either Tom or Mike on that one.
All I can say is the law language in the definition of soil and fill recyclable materials includes the word soil by itself without any reference to how you got that soil. So I imagine that's how that came to that conclusion, that's just part of it.
So it seems like it really is driving at the dirt itself, not excluding the entities, but the dirt is really the driver of this, whether it is the recyclers taking it in, whether it's a finished product going back out. That's kind of where my first question was based off of before, and the confusion after, because it does really seem to be focused on the dirt, which is where the problem is going to generate from if there is an issue.
And Caleb, when you had looked at the statute, where did you see that responsibility landing? With the material or with the entities? What do you think?
That's what kind of we did. I don't have any clarification on that, and that's why my first question was, is all dirt being viewed as dirty? Because if it is, then it's a dirt issue. If it's not, then it's really the recyclers that are taking it in or the entities that are dealing with it is where the targeted enforcement would come in. So that's, and I know this is still early on, so there really isn't any clarity, but it seems kind of like it's going both ways, and that's where my confusion is.
Well, I was just wondering, do you have an opinion either way? Because we'd like to hear that too, because it may be an issue that's up for debate and interpretation, and we'd like to know what you think about it, because we would like to factor that in too.
We could, as we start to understand more and we get a little bit more feedback, we could probably put something together. We're just trying to figure out, okay, what's the driving source behind this? And there'll be a lot of dirt that moves outside of the entities that seem like they're being targeted. So at the end of the day, if it's going to be enforced or whatever is going to be enforced, we just want it to make sense and accomplish its goal without being onerous on everyone. Because otherwise you just end up with certain industries or certain companies or whoever being targeted, other ones are not, and it tips the scales one way or another.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to add really quickly, this is Anna. One of the things that is important to understand is that this is an amendment to the A901 law. So the A901 law itself serves as a vetting process for entities that are engaged in a certain industry. So originally the solid and hazardous waste industry. So I understand your question. It makes sense. It's not necessarily like you can point to one specific source of where this is coming from. It's like this is also being incorporated into the A901, so that way the entities themselves can be vetted, the personnel and the people behind it. But then we also come into the issue that we're addressing currently is dealing with the material itself and the material being used and returned into the economic mainstream. So that there's a bunch of different factors in which you're mentioning.
Yeah, with the A901 and dirt that's been, the material that's handled there has already been classified. So I guess that was kind of the genesis of my question was, how do we figure out what materials we're talking about? Are we talking about all dirt, or are we really just talking about the people that handle that dirt? Because with A901, it's pretty clear. Once you pass a certain line, then you're here. We don't view everything that way. It's only certain dirt that's got contaminants over certain levels. Then it's very easy because that has to go to certain places. This amendment or law isn't clear yet, so it's kind of hard to tell where it's going because we're not sure where it's coming from yet.
All right. Thank you very much for your thoughts. We appreciate that. Next up, we have Robert Lippincott. Welcome back, Robert.
I figured that in the spirit of returning, since everyone else is, I thought I'd take one more bite at the apple. This is a great process, by the way. I really appreciate the department doing this. I'll be quick. Just a note. I mean, the question is de minimis quantity, and that question I understand is something hopefully this feedback is helping the department answer that question. I think that there was an earlier comment about location, and one thing I would suggest is looking at historic fill material areas that's on the state's GIS, because that gives you an idea of soil quality in areas where say where it's mapped and where it isn't. It's not. It's just part of an analysis to consider. That's for like the pool contractor question. The other, just to get back to a comment, and I don't mean to go tit for tat with anyone, but I wanted to clarify some of the definition of broker and consultant. In the law, a consultant means a person who performs functions for a business concern engaged in the collection, transportation, treatment, storage, I guess what someone said before, and maybe I said it too, was that these definitions are very broad, and so what I'm concerned with, I think what's contributing to uncertainty among us in the industry, from my discussions with a number of people, is how that broad of a definition is subject to interpretation. It's very subjective, and so, for instance, as example, a person who performs functions for a business concern. Well, what functions? You know, there's a lot to be said for that. I can tell you that I'm sure I can speak for a lot of consultants that have been in this business for a long time, that we know data a lot better than a lot of the, no offense to anyone, but the contractors, and sample parameters, sample procedures, and we deal with this stuff as an LSRP in the state, and doing this for a number of years, and I know this stuff inside and out, and so a 901's registration doesn't give you the quality necessarily that somebody that with that background does. And so I would hate to see a brain drain of people who say, well, that's, that's not what I'm doing. I'm going to be forced into this. I can't do that.
Robert, may I interrupt for a second? Because
sure.
I think you've been probably sitting right behind me looking over my shoulder, because we're going to be getting to that point.
Oh, okay, good. Well, then
after
I'll stop there.
Some of the questions. Okay.
I'll stop there. Good.
We'll bring you back.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I'm going to wait with bated breath.
Okay, sounds
okay.
good.
All right, thanks.
Let's hear from Jennifer Zelezzi. Good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. Hang on, and my hand is down. Yes.
All right.
Okay, great.
There you are.
Hi. My name's Jennifer Zelezzi. I'm with Bayshore Recycling, and I also sit on the board of the Association of New Jersey Recyclers, and I'm also on the EDC steering committee. And we've been heavily involved in this situation. Gary Sondermeyer works with me at Bayshore, and he was involved with the SCI investigation. So we really have a good handle on the intent, and appreciate the department's attempt to, get this into a place that everybody can kind of live with, but and keep everyone in compliance at the same time. So I think, I just wanted to add before, when you were asking, what should the issues be? Is it the entity or the material? I think it's a combination of both. I think that, what the gentleman who was previously talking, and I'm sorry, was saying that, about the material itself. I guess it's like when the generator of the material loses control of the soil, like, so wherever it's coming from, who's responsible for that, and then handing it off to the entity who's actually arranging for that disposal. And the language is already in the statute in many ways, but then it's all the people in between. Does the sampler, the person that, the professional that went out to take the samples of the soil and characterize it, they may make recommendations to where the material might go based on their knowledge of what material fits what bill. But at the end of the day, if they don't make that, determination and control where it's going, I'm not sure that that's the department's intention, to capture them within the chain of command, say, or the chain of custody almost, for where that dirt went. So I think that if there's I don't know, if it's more refined about, and just focusing on, I guess, who controls the decision making on where the material is going to end up, that would clarify a lot of things for a lot of people because, a facility, we're a class B that can take soil. So we see a lot where, we get a person that comes in and says, we have this dirt, we ask for the data. Sometimes they don't want to give us the data. Sometimes they give us data, and then they get sticker shocked, and then they're like, well, we're not doing this, and then you never hear from them again, and God knows where they dumped. So in solid waste, I feel like the people in between also wouldn't have been captured, so to speak, as long as they hire an A901 entity. So I think that if all the facilities that take soil, like where you guys were going initially, and there's a whole unregulated community of like mine reclamation and things like that, where it's clean if you demonstrate that it's clean. But what are those parameters? What are the sampling frequencies that are associated with that? Do they follow the SRP guidance so as not to create another contaminated site like we were talking about in the beginning? I think all those things would just help to clarify applicability and then achieve the department's goals. And I had a question about what the reporting requirements were going to be. So then how many people in between are going to have to report on the same?
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah, sorry.
And actually, where you were going with the reporting, that's going to be our next question.
Okay, sorry.
That we'll be getting there. You guys, you're in my brain. It's a wonderful thing. I just wanted to try and distill your thought on the control and the material. So am I correct in stating that it's more your view of that controlling party from where it came from and the controlling party for where it goes? They would be the key, not necessarily what's in between, but basically the origination zone and the destination and those ultimate controlling parties. Is that?
Yeah.
I'm trying to distill.
And it might be a direct relationship, but there might be someone in between who would be the broker to make the arrangement. So the generator says, I don't know what to do with this. I'm hiring you, broker man or woman, to find a home for this, and then that's the ultimate, that's the ultimate chain of custody. Like who, okay. If there's another broker who hires another broker, then they're both in that chain. But then, figuring out how then that gets reported back. And so the department's not seeing like the same, it's going to look like 3 or 4, I guess, reports for the same pile of dirt if there's that many people involved in between.
Okay. I think I got it. And then we're going to get to your reporting issue next. So let me put you on hold until we get to the next question. We still had Wolfgang. You're making a reappearance. Hello again.
Hello. Yeah, just been an interesting conversation this afternoon, listening to everybody speak, and it dawned on me that the problem isn't your legitimate processors. If anything, maybe you need to tighten up some of the requirements that legitimate processors are doing, but they're not the problem. They're not the ones that have created the problems that the DEP has been wrestling with. Most of it is illegal facilities that suddenly set themselves up, and it's believe it or not, it is the small guys, the independent guys that go to New York City, they pick up a load, and they're just told to get rid of it. And that's really where the department should be focusing its efforts and its regulations at. The same thing with the A901. So, leave the legitimate guys alone. They're doing a good job. They're doing it the right way. Let's try to focus and narrow the scope of this thing so that you're reining in the folks that are hauling the dirt. I'm not on the same page as everybody about the pool guys that take out dirt or bring in fill dirt, to fill a hole. I think you got to look closely at that activity and certainly the illegal facilities. But let's exempt or tighten up a little bit on the processors, the legitimate ones, but leave them alone.
All right, we'll take that into consideration. Thanks for your additional input. Next, we have Keith Prince, and then Robert Keane, and then we're going to move on to the next slide with the reporting question. So Keith, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having us. Mr. Skakel just touched on some points that I wanted to, but thanks for being eloquent and taking care of that for me. The other point I had was contractors on sites. On a construction site, there may be 20,000 yards of topsoil that has to leave that site. The contractor is not necessarily an entity, the way I see it, nor is he being obligated to contact an entity to receive that soil. So what happens when the contractor decides, hey, I'm going to sell this dirt a load at a time, 10 loads at a time, whatever? How does he fall into the scope of this new regulation? If the material doesn't end up in an entity, how does this rule cover that material, so to speak?
10 loads at a time.
Or is there going to be some mechanism that assures the material ends up at an entity, a legal entity, so to speak?
Well, Keith, the statute gives us the parameters that we have to work from.
Right.
And when it comes to the regulation, this is kind of the question that I'd like to toss back at you. You know, where should we draw that line? What do you think about it?
As an entity, we did receive our A901, and as an entity, we'd probably like to see that regulated. But, and I think these type of jobs are a big part of the problem. Mr. Skakel was speaking about, you know, the smaller guys, and they're not really the issue as much as some of these 10 and 20 and 30,000 yard projects where there's a contractor on site that may not be A901 licensed and therefore not regulated the same way we are, you know. So my concern is that you're going to turn this into, I'm sure you're not trying to, but it's turning into something that's one-sided, so to speak. And how do we include either all the dirt or none of the dirt? I mean, what's the primary focus, you know?
That's a great question that I've been asking myself for some time now.
I'm sorry.
So Keith, this is Tom Farrell. Would you suggest doing something like RCRA does, a cradle to grave, that the property owner is responsible for that material?
Something to that effect. As it is now, we require paperwork on everything that our facility receives. We've been doing that for years, and it's not that way out in the real world. It's just not that way. So if everybody was held to the same standard, the problem is I don't know how you enforce this. Difficult. I mean, you can write the regulation, but moving forward, how does that regulation get enforced? You know?
Keith, would you like to switch sides?
I mean, there's stuff popping in my mind every minute we're talking here, and it just, the problem is it gets worse and not better.
And it blossoms into just this big
either
thing.
blossoms or the flowers die in here, because I'm seeing it, some of this going in the opposite direction I think we're trying to move in. Just food for thought.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for hearing me.
And for our last speaker on this point, Robert Keane.
Hi,
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and I guess the comments aren't really de minimis, but the comments keep going back and forth with a lot of different topics, and I may have to bump off, but as Jennifer said before from Bayshore, you know, there's the small guys too, but there's also the big guys and the reclamation people, and I know Mike was talking about regulating the entity, but I think it's also, you know, some of the, like, I work with P-Park, and we basically have a giant hole to fill, and we're taking in clean, and we've talked to plenty, like Tom and you guys, plenty of times coming down there, exploring ideas for our facility, but we're still looking for that guidance. After, you know, we're already regulated. I have an A901 and I have a Class B, but not for soil. But now the the A901 lets me do soil mixed with concrete, but but that's not really part of the A901, but the soil, and we're just looking for some sort of uniformity for everybody in the same sort of boat to have some sort of guidelines. And then we did get a ruling from Anthony Fontana with respect to solid waste, with dermal inhalation. But then again, if we're now selling it and recycling it to somebody else and they're putting it on their ground, does migration to groundwater come in? And they say, well, we don't want to make more, site remediation programs than the allotment too, with respect to tying this A901 into some regulatory tie back to the soil standards, which are only for the site remediation program. But again, you're talking about the migration to groundwater standard, which is now promulgated. How does that sort of play into the thinking for the future? Or especially like us, if we're putting some of this in our hole, are we supposed to be looking for that?
Yeah.
But then trying, on a realistic side, trying to get people to come into our facility, and I'm like, okay, well, here's our soil standard or soil requirements, and you meet these, but you fail this, and now you got to do SLP, and they're going to say, you know what, I don't want to go to you. I got thousands of dollars of analytical to try to figure out whether this can meet your requirements to put in the ground. I'm just going to bring it somewhere else where they don't have to worry about this. So, again, a lot of food for thought. I give you credit. I definitely appreciate this opportunity to talk. I know I might not be in turn with respect to, so other people brought up different topics, but there's a lot to go on, and I'm glad you're getting our involvement, and I'm hopeful to keep going forward with this and add anything I can or go forward.
All right, thank you very much. We'd like to move on to the next slide. Ray Cantor, I see that you're there. We'll get to you after Tom does the next slide that's following.
Sure. Oops. Is this
Yep,
the next slide?
that's
Okay.
it.
What documentation should NJDEP use or require for material to avoid triggering the requirements of the law?
All right, Ray, if your answer to the prior question would also answer this, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we can definitely get back to you because we hope to have a little bit of a general back and forth roundtable of the issues we discussed closer to the end of the program. So raising hands for documentation question. Wow, Tom, I wasn't expecting this one. Oh, we have one. Hi, Tracy. How are you? Welcome back. Tracy, you're still muted.
I'm sorry about that.
There you go.
My point and click didn't point and click properly. But as far as documentation, I think there's a couple ways to look at this. One is there's one whole subset of materials that are being generated by state contracts, whether they're construction contracts, whether they're being put up by entities, and there's already a process where somebody has gone through the qualifications to be able to bid it, and a resident engineer or somebody that's watching and approving all that work. So there's that's a huge amount of the construction projects that there's already somebody from the state watching it and may have a nice, easy way to track it without getting into a giant process. The same with the site remediation program. We've got LSRPs when they're doing that work. A lot of material gets generated from these site remediation projects, and the LSRP is reviewing every piece of documentation and signing off on that. So those are two really easy lifts to take some of the burden off of the people that are doing the work, whether it's the material coming in, the material going off, that have eyes and ears on the ground, boots on the ground, that are managing that. So maybe there's a way to carve those kinds of projects out.
That's a good idea. I really personally don't know how we do that. If you have some ideas about like parameters, please send us an email.
There's actually an old court decision that was done in New Jersey called the Burnt Fly Bog decision. And this went through the courts years ago, and it was a very limited decision, but it pretty much said that the state's there, they've approved it, they're watching it. Why are we going through this 901 process for this very small task in a much larger context?
I haven't heard burnt fly bog in decades.
Yes, that actually went to court over just this issue decades ago. So I can actually send you that decision, because years ago when I had this discussion with the AG's office, and Harley Williams that was down there at the time, he's the one that pointed me to this decision, and our firm had a 901 and we gave it up because we don't own trucks, we don't own facilities, we don't do anything. And he pretty much said, you don't need it because within the context of the work you're doing, here's the court case that says why you don't do it. So, but that's real narrow for me. But the bigger picture is you've got all these professionals doing it. Why are you going to create a giant paperwork burden at the end of the day? You know, the DOT is going to sign off on it. The LSRP is going to sign off on it. On direct oversight, DEP is going to sign over it. So the big chunks of material are pretty easy to manage.
Good perspective. Thank you very much, Tracy. I'd like to jump back to Jennifer Zelezzi, because I remember you were talking about the issue with paperwork, and I wanted to make sure that you got back in to finish your thought from before.
Hi. Yeah. So, yeah, I just didn't know, you know, for things like this, I'm not sure that I completely understand this question for documentation. Are we talking about during transportation or characterization?
I'll defer to Tom on that one.
So the law states that you need an A901 if you handle, broker, process, transfer soil and fill recyclable materials. We're trying to get carve-outs out of that for people we don't feel need to be in that law, which is what we just discussed for the past hour and a half. But if the decision to get you out was based on the cleanliness of the soil, which is being discussed, how do you document that?
Right. Yeah, I think that there would have to be established protocols based on, you know, sampling frequencies, or if it was a virgin site, if there's some kind of, I don't know, certification that can be made up similar to, I guess, there's a clean concrete certification, and then like the clean fills soil for reuse, that guidance document, maybe something modeling that. So, if there is areas of concern. So if you're, you know, shipping material from, I don't know, old farmland, you're going to focus on pesticides and things like that. And so, you know, that might be one way to do it. There's other, and then, you know, and then does the material get tracked? You know, are like bills of lading or manifesting going to be required for the final, to show like where it went, the final resting place, where whoever loaded the soil signs off, and then whoever received the soil signs off, and then, you know, that gets reported back. And then, or is there could be like an agent authorization form where the owner of the property fills this, like, you know, we do something like this when there's multiple contractors involved on a site, to ensure that the owner and generator of the material is aware that all these people in between are like working on where this material is going, and then that they know, you know, that it's going to end up at Bayshore, or, you know, in our case, or wherever else it's going to go, so that there's something back to the department showing that this is where this material moved from A to B, and then, you know, the subsequent place would then give a similar report. So there's kind of like a, I don't know, like a chain of custody, so to speak.
And with that type of a paper trail, would that be a heavy lift for you guys? Do you think that would be a heavy requirement on the regulated community?
I think the regulated community already is using these this kind of paperwork, and you know, we use it for invoicing and everything else as well. A lot of bigger generators of material will require that paperwork back. So, you know, we keep it on file for 3 years, up to, you know, at least 3 years, things like that. So I think the regulated community is already, you know, familiar with the process. I think that it's the unregulated community that's, you know, not currently reporting back to DEP. That's where the, you know, the heavy lift is. And, you know, I mean, everything is going to be new for anybody that's not currently doing this as part of their practice. So.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for answering and coming back online. Next up, we have Neil Rivers. Unmute.
Yep.
There you go.
Thank you again.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. So I guess a couple of things in response specifically to the question. Picking up on what Tracy was talking about, I think the idea that if If the work is being done by a New Jersey licensed professional, and I'll tighten that up a little bit. I think that form of documentation should provide some degree of protection and satisfy the requirements of the law. And so I think Tracy talked about licensed site remediation professionals. I'd add subsurface evaluators. It's another component of the site remediation program. And I would say New Jersey licensed professional engineers who have as their responsibility the protection of public health. I would also add that sort of as a related matter, again, as sort of a follow-up to what Tracy had talked about earlier, if an entity is using an A901 firm to manage the soil or fill material, that form of documentation might also be sufficient and satisfactory. Obviously, any tracking documents and things of that nature, but again, to the idea that I don't, maybe I'm not A901 licensed, but we subcontract to an A901 licensed firm and make sure that the work gets done accordingly. Those are a couple of areas. One more that I would add, I think, just getting back to sort of the idea of testing. In my experience, and there are other folks here from the facility side who can speak more fully to this. But in my experience, I think that the facilities themselves have permit limitations and restrictions, and those those facilities, if they are properly licensed, and I would expect that the ones we all want to be used will be, they're going to have testing requirements themselves as part of their gatekeeping process. And so perhaps it's that documentation that satisfies the receiving facility's permit that is the documentation that could be used to determine that a material doesn't trigger the requirements of the law.
Sounds good. Thank you for the detail.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate that. Caleb, do you have more to add?
Yeah, my question was, the verbiage in the law, if I remember correctly, says if the material could be contaminated, and there really isn't any clarification offered, which is pretty broad. Who gets to determine if it could be contaminated? So when I link that up with this question, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but it's pretty much saying that you will be considered inside the requirements of the law unless there is documentation to get you out of being in it. So that's why it kind of keeps driving back. We talked a lot about A901 facilities, but that's a whole different ballgame. That most dirt that moves in the state isn't in that stream. Those guys know what to do as far as documentation, making sure they know what's coming in, making sure that it's segregated,
It's already part of the business.
Yeah, that's totally different. It's like if you brought in an engineer to build a building, or you just brought in a carpenter to put up a couple beams for you. Like, that's two totally different processes. One's going to involve measurements and drawings and engineering. They're already doing that. On the regular dirt side of things, that's what I think this law is really trying to take care of. It's not that, okay, this dirt was known contaminated, it should have gone to Bayshore, but it went to some other place. There's already rules for that. How do we know? Like, it really comes down to, is the dirt all considered dirty and then we need to exempt it, or is it not, unless we know that there's an issue? That's kind of what keeps driving me back to this.
So it seems like what I'm trying to gather from what you had said, it's more of your interpretation or position that it's more of a material focus as opposed to the business entity focus.
Yeah, we're looking for that clarification because that helps us understand, okay, which way is this going? Obviously, the entities need to know how to handle this, but is it really the dirt that's driving the equation? And how do we classify this dirt as an entity? Where does it go? Because as one of the previous people on the call said, you could have 20,000 yards on a construction site. And if you just put it out there like, hey, come pick up topsoil, that's not going, most of that's not going to go to a facility. That's going to go to a landscaper, that's going to go to a contractor, that's going to go to a wherever. It never got inside the people that it seems like are trying to be regulated. No problems were solved. No contaminated dirt was taken out of the market and taken where it was supposed to go.
Yeah, that's what Keith was talking about before.
Correct.
I'm with you. We'll definitely be thinking about that. I mean, there's a lot of different perspectives, and all of you are giving us a lot of good points to chew on that we're definitely going to be considering. Caleb, I hate to cut you short at this point. We have about 6 more people that I want to get in to have their comments in before we get to the polling questions. So it's already a little after 3 o'clock. We've had a lot of great discussion so far. I'd like to jump to Gwen Keeble. Hi, Gwen. How are you? I think you're still muted.
Yep, just
There
a
you
little bit
are.
of a delay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Judith. As you said, my name is Gwen Keeble. I work for Rockland Electric Company, one of our New Jersey utilities. And I just wanted to weigh in and say I agree with the concept that if the material that we're managing, the excavated fill, the excavated soil, if ultimately documentation is provided that those materials were managed and transported for disposal by A901 licensed entities, then potentially the initial collection of those materials might not trigger these requirements for licensing and registration. In other words, you know, as a utility, we're under you know, the oversight of the BPU and the scrutiny of the BPU and many other agencies. And our work frequently requires that we collect these fill and soil materials in locations where they can't be stored and characterized, right? So we have an obligation to move those materials quickly off site before we're able to fully characterize them. And so the characterization often occurs elsewhere, off-site, on a property under our control. And then ultimately, once we know what we've got, we would hire an A901 company to come in and transport for final disposal or for final recycling. And so perhaps there's an opportunity for that interim state to occur without triggering the full licensing and registration process.
That's a really good point. We're going to definitely be thinking about that. Thank you very much. Let's go to Bill Roberts. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Hi again. Yeah, I'm looking at this question, and to me, it's reading, how do we get around the law? It's avoid triggering the requirements of the law. You're basically seeing how can we get around it? And
how do you want to keep yourselves out?
Yeah, so I think that I think Wolf Skasel made the comment that the big facilities are also already heavily regulated, and I think Jennifer did as well. And so there are documentation that we require before it can come in, and I don't see why that shouldn't apply to pretty much to everybody. And then whether it's a 901 or not, it's either going to be approved or rejected. So the small generator, if they comply with the documentation that the facilities require, and whether it goes to a facility or goes to somebody's farm, I think it shouldn't matter. We have to be manifested. We have to be in compliance with not just our solid waste, but also our air and SRP approvals. You know, it has to be non-hazardous. It has to meet paint filter. It's got to be tested for SVOCs and so on. All that documentation is provided, plus the address where it came from, the generator, the financier, all the rest of it. It's all part of our MCR program. And none of that will come in unless there's an approval number. So the truck has to have that in its possession to be able to come into the facility. And I don't see why that should be any different for any other receiving site. So if that documentation is is in the possession of the trucker, it's going to go to a non-facility, which is highly regulated, then I think they have complied with the law and will meet the environmental requirements that DEP is holding the rest of the community to.
Well, thank you very much. They were very thoughtful points, and we're definitely going to be considering those as we go forward. Thank you.
And as far as reporting goes, we have to report all that information typically in a 50 to 100 page document every quarter. So DEP has all that in its records.
Okay, so it's already happening.
It's already happening.
Good to know. Thank you.
You bet.
Next, Franklin Benning. Did I pronounce your last name right?
Yes, Frank Bonning here. Thanks very much. Very close. I'm an attorney. I work a lot in the environmental arena as well in the solid waste arena with A901 licensing rules. So the question as it's posed here was a little confusing when you popped it up, because we heard a lot in the last section that this is focused not on the materials, but it's focused on the people, the entities doing the work. So when you talk about what documentation is required or should be required for the materials to avoid triggering the requirements, it does bring it back to this ultimately is geared to regulate soil and fill materials, not necessarily the people. And again, it brings it back to Caleb asked a couple of times, do we presume all dirt and recyclable materials are contaminated and you have to demonstrate that they're clean, or do we presume they're all dirty presume they're all clean and somebody needs to tell us that they're dirty in order to bring us into the rules? And I think that's a threshold question that needs to be considered in this. And you know, a lot of people have talked about different standards and testing requirements and all that sort of thing. So I won't go into that further. But one point I just wanted to raise quickly beyond that threshold question is I think the department should consider allowing, much like it is in RCRA, process knowledge of source material. There are a lot of materials that come out of industrial operations, industrial byproducts that are used to make topsoil, to make compost, to make other materials. And if that is a sort of a steady state process, it's the same material, you know, over and over for months or even years at a time. The department shouldn't have a per cubic yard threshold for sampling and characterization of that material. But if you can demonstrate what it is and the process stays the same, you know, it would eliminate a lot of testing, a lot of costs, if you can use process knowledge, particularly where things are coming out of industrial processes or coming out of similar areas. And so I think that process knowledge could be very helpful to the industry to avoid a lot of costs.
Franklin, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We'll definitely be taking that under advisement. I hope one of our note takers had written that down. Thank you so much. I got to move on to Robert Lippincott.
Hi again, everybody. It's a great point, Franklin, and I think that underscores what I had suggested earlier, that it's source related. And I would say also, similar to my former comment, some of this answer to this question about documentation really, I think, comes from RCRA. All my training in RCRA is in practice is that under RCRA and the related regulations that flow into New Jersey and New Jersey's rules that adopt RCRA by reference, et cetera, require that, let's say, a generator is responsible to identify their contamination or their wastes, to ID it and to categorize, classify it, and then keep those records. And they have a record retention period. But that's not something that's submitted. It's something that's kept at the facility. for review if needed.
So more of a keep your own records in the event that
Yeah.
the department or someone else asks you, gee, did you happen to do this?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that makes sense. I mean, I don't know the department wants all of this information started to be reported and have to deal with it all. I'm not sure that that's a policy decision. The department's gonna have to decide on how you want to do that. But to me, it's really documenting your compliance or documenting your non-compliance. To me, that's one way. That's a little bit of an add-on to the question, I understand, but it's the documentation to require for the material. It would just be something that you maintain. And what is it that you would maintain? Well, whatever analytical, whatever basis you're using, and in the RECRA world, of course, it's generator knowledge of the process, as Franklin said, and it's, I think, in this case, as an LSRP and doing waste management for years, I can tell you that it's standard practice to not only hold on to, collect data, collect the appropriate number of samples, follow the guidance that's already there. Somebody mentioned earlier, we have guidance, the fill guidance in the SRP program, and other similar guidance, and the regulations. As an LSRP, I'm required to keep documents for 10 years. So a lot of these things are in place. I understand this sort of sounds like there's some carve-outs actually in the Q&As and the policy that's put out in the interim, and probably coming in the rule for other licensed professionals like LSRPs. But these are the reasons, because these things are already established, as I think Wolf referred to as well earlier. So
All right.
My one point on requirements, though, I want to point out, and one of the reasons why this is a little bit of an uncertain issue for us, is in the question and answer document from the Division of Solid Hazard Waste. It says under question 6, Q16, regarding a license, an LSRP requiring the license. It says no, right? As long as the person is retained to manage it. Then it says it should be noted that another person, that if another person is subcontracted to procure contaminated soil for or remove contaminated soil from a site, a remediation site, including a person employed by the same company as the LSRP, that person is required to have the license. And my point is this: it's a broad brush, and maybe we don't. I just want to make sure everybody understands here that when you say LSRP, oh, you have this carve out. Well, wait a minute. An LSRP in our world, we can by law rely on other professionals, and when I have staff to review things that I'm going to oversee, this is telling me, I think, maybe I don't understand this, but the way it reads, my staff is going to have this license. That's not an LSRP, but that's a person that works under me. I'm not sure that if the department has discretion, I think that should be considered.
Well, Robert, that the LSRP issue is one of the issues that we're going to be discussing at a future stakeholder meeting. That's something that we're going to be donating a lot of time to. So I just wanted to let you know, rest assured, we're aware that there's questions with that and that we will be addressing it. I don't think we can fit it in the extra 42 minutes that we have today.
No,
but we will get there.
Thanks.
So, Robert, thank you so much. I'd like to move on to David Morris. Hi again, David.
Hey, hello again. Yeah, I know where timing is an issue. I mean, I love what I'm hearing from Franklin and Robert. It's obvious we're going to have to, that people are going to have to look per project. As an LSRP, I've used that solid waste clean concrete certification during my SRP retained activities. So the department could gatekeep or prescribe it. It may be a self-held form, but gatekeep the applicability by the source regulation, known regional conditions, and the material quantity, that we're talking about. But let's not reinvent the wheel. We can generate from these existing tools. I think, Jennifer first mentioned the solid waste, clean concrete document. What could be used would be a similar but different document, which would be per material, per source, form, kind of like a more robust O&D form that we already have. You know, the fill guidance discusses performing a preliminary assessment to understand the origin, location, history. You know, possibly a limited review focusing on NGEMS and GeoWeb could be used to design a tool for these no-go decisions, regulated versus unregulated presumptively, for that applicability. You know, for instance, we use regulated tanks, ISRA, the presence of a PI number at the origin for the Madden triggers, you know, that came out of the Kitty College fiasco, and they already make locations subject to regulation or review by the DOH, the DEP, DCF, and the DCA. You know, and then we could do desktop reviews for mapped regional fill, land use types, you know, the activity and use controls, glauconitic sources. It's all then, you know, confoundments due to agricultural land. They're all GIS mapped, you know, so we can, what it comes down to, we can use variable quantities having variable requirements, and then you know, use the testing in a measured way, you know, nil to less to more. You know, but definitely, I think the idea of having people police themselves for the records, you know, because that's already being done.
Thank you very much. Good insight. Next, Keith Prince.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. We'll be then getting to both Jim and Ray, and then we're going to move on to the poll questions. So, Keith.
Okay. I have a very short point.
Sure.
Due to the paperwork and the economic cost of doing all this, I'm looking at it from as a entity or facility standpoint, and I'm looking at it saying to myself, why would anybody bring material to a facility? The cost and the burden. My concern is that you're gonna drive a lot of soil and fill away from the entities that are doing it properly because of the cost and economics. I don't know how you attempt to handle that, and I understand that's a daunting task because again, it looks to me like a lot of people that we deal with are going to say, well, heck, I'm just not going to take it there. I'm going to do something else, and that may not be within the law, but we all have to sit here and admit that it does happen, you know. Then there's one other small thing, is natural constituents within the state of New Jersey. We all know that arsenic and manganese and certain things exist within our soils naturally. Is there a way to treat them differently within the regulation?
That I don't know yet, but if you do have a position on that, I'd ask that you please email that to us, because we'd like to take that under consideration too.
I will, thank you.
All right. Keith, thanks so much. I'd like to move on to Jim Eversano. Jim, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing well. Judy, how are you doing?
Doing good, thanks.
Good. Well, I want to thank DEP for the opportunity to participate today. So I guess my focus here is probably a little narrower. I know we've talked about, you know, the testing requirements and documentation, but I just want to make sure, you know, for confirmation when the rule gets adopted, is that there are obviously other exemptions to the rule, like, for example, if the generator obtains a beneficial use approval. And I think in that respect, you know, in terms of answering, you know, what documentation should NJDEP use or require, it should really just be that the person would have to produce the approval, because, you know, that approval will be issued really on a project-specific basis and will be vetted accordingly. So there shouldn't be any additional sampling or documentation, you know, that really should be necessary in that regard.
Or they don't forget the bud.
Right. True. And I guess the other point is, and this is really a point of clarification, the exemption in the statute says beneficial use for which the generator obtained approval. And I think that language is a little broader than just obtaining, you know, what's sort of known as a bud. And one of the things I would say is, for example, there's material that closed landfills accept for their regrading projects that they will bring in fill, and that fill will only be brought in if it's approved in advance by DEP, most of the times in a closure plan or a closure plan modification, or sometimes a disruption permit. And whatever approval form it is, that approval typically requires like a material acceptance protocol that will have to be followed in order for the landfill to accept that material as part of its regrading project. And that means that specific material is highly regulated. And I don't think, another layer of regulation would be necessary in that regard. So I think as long as that material is in compliance with the material acceptance protocol and the closure plan approval or disruption approval, then that should also be, acceptable for demonstrating that the material is exempt from the requirements.
So basically, if the homework is already being done, can we use some of that process that already exists and paperwork that already exists and fold that into the rule? So that basically you might end up getting like a 2-for-1, so to speak, because it's stuff that you already do.
Yeah.
With that type of information, please send us an email, send us your ideas with that, because we'd like to have a good idea of what you already do that might work. Because if we can fold in something like that, I mean, it's definitely something that we'd want to consider.
Okay, that's great. We will do that. And then the other thing I would also, as part of that, I think confirmation would be helpful that the landfill, for a regrading project, such as that, part of a closure plan, if you're accepting that material, you wouldn't be subject and required to get an A901 license. So that would be also part of the exemption as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim. Much appreciate your ideas. I'd like to move on to Ray Cantor, and this is the last commenter we're going to have for this particular issue. Ray, how are you? How's your afternoon going?
Afternoon is going fine. One, I want to apologize because I got on here late, so I missed the first hour or more of the conversation. So
well, you'll have to pull up the recording on our Stakeholder webpage, because we'll be posting that there.
I will do that, and hopefully my comments are in line with what you're looking for, if not particularly on the specific slide that is up on the screen right now. I also want to echo some of the concerns that Wolf had mentioned earlier about keeping this as simple as possible and targeting where it should be targeted. There are lots of issues you could deal with of how to dispose of material, which material where, under what conditions, with what testing protocols and paperwork, etc. I'm not going to address that. I will leave that to all the professionals who deal in this field to make those determinations. I'm going to focus on what I think the dirty dirt law says should be happening, and I assume that that's what this is, ultimately all about. Was that law does not set up requirements that we regulate things differently. If we should regulate things differently from a material perspective, then the department should take that, opportunity and change its, particular laws under SRP or solid waste and do so. But this law is all about who do we trust to follow the law. And that's why the law, it's requiring that for certain new materials, soil and full recyclable materials, that these people have an A901 process. But you want to make sure that the one who is going to be making those ultimate disposal decisions is responsible, is not basically, a criminal, which is what A901 was originally meant to do, and that they are following the law. So from that perspective, I think it was mentioned earlier as well, that so long as there's someone in that chain who has the direct responsibility of disposing of the material as an A901 licensed material, you really don't need anyone else who's handling that material prior to that to be A901 licensed, be it the LSRP, be it someone at the site, etc. So long as the person who's ultimately responsible for that material being disposed of is A901 licensed, then the department has done its part in ensuring that a responsible person with a license is in charge of that material. So you should probably, again, have exemptions for LSRPs, for small quantity generators, for utilities, for self-generators, but it's really focusing on who you could trust, who you could not trust, and that's what this law is all about. Everything else you're talking about is great if the department finds there's a need for that, but my point is that the law is not mandating you change your processes for how soil or solid waste or recyclable materials are handled.
Good points. Thank you very much, Ray. We'll take it under advisement. At this point, I'm going to pitch it back to Tom because we want to jump into the poll questions to be able to get some of your additional ideas and thoughts in electronic writing. So back to Tom, and here we go.
Sure, thank you, Judy. I want to remind you that this presentation is open for 24 hours. So in order to keep these 10 questions going, I'm going to move on after a minute, and I'll let you know when 10 seconds is, we're up to 50-second mark. But if you don't have enough time to answer, don't worry about it. You can get back on and you can answer within the next 24 hours. Okay, so what you're going to see after I ask the question, or simultaneously sometimes, is a message pop up. You get onto the chat, you hit on that link, and you answer the question there. So yeah, and make sure you give us your name and affiliation so we know what entities or what are interested in. Some entities are interested in one type of thing, others are interested in another type of thing. So for the first question, for transportation of soil and fill recyclable materials, if a de minimis exemption was established, what should it be based on? Your choices are A, since the law does not specifically provide for such exemption, none should be established. Or B, an exemption should apply to certain industries for which mismanagement of soil and fill recyclable materials has historically not been found, and therefore there should be no need for a de minimis quantity for such entities. Or C, whatever the de minimis quantity is, it should be based on the actual amount of soil and fill recyclable materials transported and not the capacity of the vehicles/trailers hauling same. Or D, a vehicle trailer capacity combination not to exceed 15 cubic yards. Or E, other, please type it in. I'll give you 1 minute. And again, if you can't answer in 1 minute, you can always access the chat later and answer then.
I just want to remind people that people who are answering in the chat, you can answer these questions following the link that Tyrone had sent. So if you go into the chat and you click on the link that Tyrone sent, you can answer the questions there, not in the chat.
Yeah. If you answer in the chat, we won't be able to compile all the answers and figure out who wants what. And there are no wrong answers, okay?
So everyone, please make sure that you do not put these answers in the chat. Please take these answers and put them into the link that Tyrone had sent that's kind of above. Click on that link and you can answer it there. Like Tom said, we won't be able to get your answers if you put them in the chat. We want to be able to make sure that we record all of your responses.
10 seconds. Okay, on to the next question. Next slide, please. Question 2, with regard to soils or soil-like materials, what should be acceptable documentation that such materials do not trigger the applicability of the law? A, laboratory analysis indicating that contaminants do not exceed the residential ingestion dermal or residential inhalation soil remediation standards for NJAC 7:26D. B, generated from an undeveloped property outside of an urban area. C, generated from a virgin quarry. D, either A, B, or C as applicable, or E, please type in. 1 minute. 10 seconds. Question 3. If documentation via laboratory analysis is applicable to support exclusion from the subject law, what should be the minimum analytical parameters employed? Your choices are A, target analyte list and target compound list, B, target analyte list and target compound list, minus volatile organics if soil gas screening warrants such limitation. C, other, please type in. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 4. When laboratory analysis is used to document an activity or material excluded from the subject law, what should the minimum requirements be to support the validity of such data? Your choices are A, in accordance with NJAC 7:26E 2.1 quality assurance requirements within the technical requirements for site remediation. B, whatever quality assurance requirements are in place for such laboratory within the state where the analysis are being performed. C, other, please type in. 1 minute. Okay, next slide, please. Question 5. When laboratory analysis is used to document exclusion from the subject law, what should the analytical frequency be to generate data that is representative of such materials? Your choices are A, consistent with the NJDEP guidance document, Fill Material Guidance for SRP Sites, October 2021. B, one analysis for every 20 cubic yards of material. C, other, please type in. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 6. What grain size in millimeters should non-soil materials be considered soil-like? Your choices are in millimeters or less. A, 3, B, 4, C, 5, D, 6, E, 7, F, 8, G, other. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 7. With regards to fill materials that are not otherwise excluded from the subject law and are not considered soil-like, should laboratory analysis be required? Your choices are A, no, B, yes, C, if waste characterization indicates such fill is not a hazardous waste and volatile organics are not a concern as documented by soil gas readings taken in accordance with the most recent version of the NJDEP Field Sampling Procedures Manual, a presumed approved beneficial use determination if used as road base, parking lot, slab base that is sealed in place is appropriate, or D, other, please type in. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 8. For non-LSRPs, or LSRPs that are not retained to remediate the site, where the soil and fill was generated, nor for the destination site for such soil and fill material, should there be a de minimis quantity of soil and fill recyclable materials that does not trigger the need for an A901 license for the generation of such materials during environmental due diligence or construction purposes? A, no, the law does not provide for such exemption. B, subsurface evaluators should be afforded a de minimis exemption when such materials are generated on projects which require their certification as a subsurface evaluator. C, provided that materials are appropriately sampled and analyzed and found not to trigger the definition of solid waste, an A901 license should not be required regardless of the professional oversight, volume, or source of the soil and fill materials. D, professional geologists and professional engineers should be afforded a de minimis exemption. E, subsurface evaluators, professional geologists, and professional engineers should be afforded an outright A901 exemption for projects that they are retained that generate or accept the soil and fill materials. And then F, other, please type in. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Question 9. Should there be a de minimis quantity that exempts soil processors from having to obtain an A901 license? A, no, the law does not specifically provide for such exemption. B, provided sufficient sampling and analysis is performed that indicates the materials do not trigger the definition of solid waste, such facilities should be exempt from the law. C, exempt facilities where the materials are stored or screened on site, no crushing or grinding, wherein the aggregate volume of separate piles of soils and separate piles of other recycled materials or mixtures of such materials are less than 100 cubic yards at any given time. D, other, please type in. 1 minute. Next slide, please. Last slide we have is for the poll questions, that is, if a de minimis exemption is established for the generation of soil and fill recyclable materials due to investigative techniques, we're talking about your soil borings here, what should the volume be? A, 15 cubic yards, B, 20 cubic yards, C, 1 cubic yard, D, 5 cubic yards. E, de minimis is not necessary if appropriate sampling and analysis indicates the definition of solid waste is not triggered. And F, other. 1 minute. Okay, so that's it for our poll questions. We had scheduled some time for discussion, but we have like 4 minutes left. I think we either will pass it to Anna. Would you like to take it over from here, or Judy?
I got it. Thank you,
You
Tom.
got it. Okay.
Yes. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna. Thank you for answering those poll questions. Like Tom said, in the interest of time, we had scheduled time for discussion after these poll questions. However, because everybody just gave so much great feedback and we had a lot of information that we are taking home with us, we're going to skip that discussion. However, we have another stakeholder meeting scheduled for January 25th. The date is posted at the end of the PowerPoint slide, so don't worry, you won't miss it. And we'll be sure to cover the discussion of these poll questions in our upcoming stakeholder meeting. So I'm going to take you through the A901 law amendment, including our favorite topic, the brokers, consultants, and sales. So like I said, because in the interest of time, we're trying to minimize as much comments that aren't related to this. I just want to keep that in mind for the rest of the presentation. All right, so here we are with this slide. So in 1983, the existing A901 law required disclosure statements and licenses for entities engaged in the solid and hazardous waste industry in New Jersey. Although the statute did not define the term broker, the rules did, and the new amendment to the law now includes some new terms. Some of them are broker, consultant, and salesperson in the statute text. These changes are among other amendments to the A901 law that we will discuss in future stakeholder meetings. So this will not be your last opportunity to discuss any of the amendments to the existing A901 law. So the A901 law now with these amendments includes the terms broker, consultant, and salesperson, and we're going to go over some of that in our next slide. Okay, so this is just a little graphic. So as defined in the law, a broker means a person who, for direct or indirect compensation, arranges agreements between a business concern and its customers for the collection, transportation, treatment, storage, processing, transfer, or disposal of solid and hazardous waste, or the provision of soil and fill recycling services. So you can see on this slide we have some key words underlined. Receives compensation either directly or indirectly, and also arranges agreements between one person and the other. A consultant is defined as a person who performs functions for a business concern engaged in the collection, transportation, treatment, storage, processing, brokering, transfer, or disposal of solid waste, hazardous waste, or the provision of soil and fill recycling services, provided that the consultant shall not include a person who performs functions for a business concern and holds a professional license from the state to perform those functions. So I'm sure many of you have seen this term, especially with that last inclusion of the holding a professional license. And then we have a salesperson, which means a person or persons that makes or arranges for sales for a business concern for the collection, transportation, treatment, storage, processing, transfer, or disposal of solid waste, hazardous waste, or the provision of soil and fill recycling services. So key terms here are makes or arranges for the sales of a business concern. So that is quite a lot to unpack. And so these terms are all things that we want to get feedback from you as the regulated community, as attendees of the stakeholder meeting, because this is something that we've received a lot of feedback recently. So as stated previously, the terms are now officially defined in the law as they haven't been before. So if you or your company falls under these categories of broker, salesperson, or consultant based off of the definition, an A901 license is required. However, this comes with the understanding that there is discussion about these terms, as it's not necessarily so cut and dry. So please, I would suggest for discussion, we want to know what's the difference in these roles for you. How does this inclusion in the law impact or not impact your business? So as a reminder, like Judy mentioned, please raise your hand and wait until you're called upon before unmuting, and then lower your hand once you've finished your thoughts and comments. And like I mentioned previously, please make sure that you address these comments to be related to this topic. I know that you all have so much that you want to be able to share with us, and we appreciate all of that information a lot. But we want to make sure that we keep it to the topic of this slide here. So if anybody wants to discuss, we'll pass it to Judy to facilitate the discussion. I'm looking at sorry, but did we have a slide 28?
I already answered that question. Slide 28 was exactly what's in the upper corner of this slide 31, which was basically the reminder of raising your hand etiquette and asking questions. So let's hear first from Maria Colsey-Hurd. Hi, Maria. Thanks for hanging in with us this afternoon.
That's fine. Thank you. And you can just say Maria Hurd. I'm interested in the new definition of broker. And there are a number of people that I can see participating that I've already had this dialogue with, but there are many others that have not. And I'm an attorney representing some companies that are interested in this new definition. And I appreciate that Anne Maria, she underlined some key terms and trying to figure out exactly what this new definition means, who is captured by it, and that it's not interpreted in a way that's overly broad. Arranges agreements between business concern and customers, I think, is a very key term. People often arrange for hazardous waste pickup or arrange for soil and fill services. Just arranging for those things is not the same as arranging agreements between. We think of a broker like a matchmaker, and their job is to bring these two entities together so that they can obtain those services. And I would urge the DEP to focus on the words arranges agreements between and give them the meaning that the legislature intended. The concern is that, and I heard some others today raise this, that if you're anywhere in the chain of a project that may use a licensed A901 waste hauler, Suddenly, the fact that there is an A901 waste hauler involved in that chain makes everyone in between a broker. And that doesn't seem to be what the statute says or what should be intended. So, for example, if you are a company that needs to hire a vendor, you have a project where as one piece of that project, you need to have some items removed from, let's say, the construction site. By hiring that vendor to come do that job, does that turn you into a broker? I would say that the DEP should say no, it does not turn you into a broker because you have to hire a vendor to give you those services. That is essentially what, there's been some assertions that it is broader than that, but I think the wording arranges agreements between needs to be looked at narrowly and given meaning.
I'm interested in, you said something that, okay, this is just cueing my mind, the word vendor.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, you use that in your clarifying definition. Could you possibly email us and let us know how you would define a vendor for purposes of this statute and rule? Because I think that would be really helpful.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I can, and Judith, you're not one of the people that's been involved in these conversations, so I can share with you the material that we've submitted previously, so you can see our more detail. I would take up the rest of the time if I went into all the details.
All right, if you could just send it to our soil and fill email that is in the last slide, and I think that either Anna or Tyrone put it in the chat from before, I'd really appreciate that.
Sure. It's really about trying to focus on what is a traditional broker. And my understanding of this was that the state didn't want waste haulers to skirt the need to be licensed by trying to say they were just brokers.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing, and I completely understand that, but in doing that, you shouldn't cast your net so wide that someone who in the course of their business is merely hiring a vendor to do a job for them gets caught up in the definition of a solid waste broker.
Interesting take.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is Mike Hastry. Just to respond to that a little bit, and for anybody who has future questions regarding this, your point is well taken, and there's a nuance there, and the biggest nuance when we apply 901 and we look to determine, well, should this person be a 901 regulator, should they not be? Part of the analysis is someone who exerts control. So yes, if I'm a secretary and I'm arranging, I'm doing the paperwork, and I put this person's name on there, that person's name on there, I'm not really exerting control with regard to either a waste decision or in this new case now, a recycling decision. However, if I'm anybody else, and even if I hire somebody, I say, I'm going to hire you to take this away. Sometimes I hire somebody, but I tell him, well, I want this disposed of here. And, the hauler could come back and say, well, I can't bring it there. They've closed down this, they've done that. And the person who originally arranged for all this now makes the decision, say, okay, well, we're going to send it over here. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. That person is exerting control. They haven't left it up just to the transporter to figure out how to dispose of it, where to dispose of it, or how to recycle it, or where to recycle it. So it depends on what degree of control is exerted in that whole equation.
All right. Thanks for the clarification, Mike. All right. With that, I'd like to move on to Robert Lippincott. Robert, I told you we'd be getting to this issue a little bit later, and here we are. And
Thanks.
we're actually, wow, we're overtime
So,
today, and I have a feeling we're still going to be talking about this issue at our next meeting too. So let's hear your initial thoughts.
well, we'll find out who the true nerds are. We'll be here at 6 o'clock still talking about this. I think that this, I'll try to keep it brief. I understand we're late, and I appreciate, was it Maria that shared those thoughts on the broker. I think, and Mike, the clarification, I think I appreciate that. I would ask to consider some aspects in thinking about the clarification regarding what the definition actually says, because I totally understand where you're coming from, but going back to this definition, it doesn't necessarily say some of what you're saying. Specifically, it says person who for direct or indirect compensation arranges agreements, right? And so the first, I guess the agreements issue is between a business concern and its customers. And I guess I'm just curious. This is broadly written, and so there is discretion that's got to be applied. I understand that, and the department's got a challenge there. You want our feedback, so I'll give you feedback from my perspective. It seems to me that it's talking about arranging agreements between a business concern and its customers. So as an LSRP, let's lay out a scenario. I'm working for a pharmaceutical that shut down, and we have to dispose of soil. So I'm working as okay, maybe as the LSRP, that's a bad example because you've already carved out something for me. So, but I have people working under me that are not LSRPs, and they're helping because I can't do it all myself, and I can rely on professionals. So they go in my company, in my organization, very well studied in this, and they go and they find contractors, and they come up with some bids, and we come up with a final contractor to use, and we go through the disposal process, classification, and everything. Now, I arranged an I don't know if I arranged an agreement there. They're gonna be subcontracted through me, through my company, but the business concern and its customer, my business concern, my client is not the business concern arranging for its customers. It's, to me, that's I don't see that fit. I think the way that I read this would be turn that around and say, I work for a soil recycling facility, and I'm going and connecting with somebody who needs to dispose of soil. Then I'm arranging for its customers. But the business concern that we're talking about in the first instance is not the one that's I'm not arranging customers for a pharmaceutical. Their customers buy drugs. So to me, it doesn't fit. And so I think that this really is focused on those business concerns that do this: collection, transportation, treatment, and storage, et cetera. Not a business concern that's doing other business and happens to be needing to disposal as part of a remediation obligation or some other obligation.
Interesting take on the definition. Thank you very much, Robert.
You're welcome.
I'd like to move on to Wolfgang. Again, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm surprised you went after 4. So.
So am I.
Good for you.
But it's all good.
So, I've gotten pulled into this because of the definition that for consultant. After I retired from DEP, I decided I couldn't sit still and decided to go into the consulting business. And I just find that the definition is so overly broad that it's pulled me into it. And I'll give you a couple of examples. If my company does permitting work, or say example, air pollution permitting, or stormwater permitting, whether it's for a solid waste facility or a soil and reuse facility. I'm pulled into this definition because I'm performing a function for a solid waste facility. If I sit in on a settlement discussion, which I've done, on a number of occasions with Mr. Hasty and Mr. Farrell, I'm performing a function for a regulated facility. We don't broker. We don't get involved in waste handling at all, other than maybe looking at, are they managing their hazardous waste, for example, properly, or are they in compliance with their solid waste permits or approvals? That's the extent of our involvement. But yet this definition of consultant, especially the way you've posted it, performs a function. Well, we're performing functions. So,
well, Wolfgang, what I'd like to ask of you, because I'm looking to see what kind of language we can use in our rules. And you had said a few times that the statutory definition of consultant is a little too expansive, and it brings you in. And if you would be so kind, would you please email us? I would love to see how you would tailor or more narrowly clarify the definition of a consultant to what your interpretation of the intent of the statute is. I would love to see those ideas.
Yeah, I really think that the reason why the term consultant was used is that many times to get around the broker connotation, the representatives will say, I'm not a broker, I'm a consultant. And so there was this attempt to pull them in regardless of what they claimed they were doing. But it's so broad, it's pulled people like myself in as well.
And honestly, if you can provide some ideas, like in writing, for how we could structure a clarifying definition, that would be great. I think that would be really helpful.
I did meanwhile apply for my A901.
Can't hurt to be safe.
Can't hurt. Thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Caleb. Caleb, thank you for joining us this afternoon and hanging in there.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Let's hear your thoughts. Sure.
So I guess this all keeps stemming back to my original thought, but what is the goal of the Dirty Dirt Law?
How do you read the statute? Do you see it as material focused or entity focused?
Well, we're trying to stay out of that, and just because I take this as we're trying to help you guys implement this law, but we can't figure out, and we can't seem to get directive as to what is the goal of the law. So it's really hard to answer poll questions or say, well, how are we going to classify or not classify or avoid getting material classified into kind of this broad spectrum, and who gets pulled into it if we don't understand what the goal is. Because, I mean, every law should have a goal.
Sure.
And in theory, if it can't get there, then it shouldn't exist to begin with.
And like we all come under the statute. We all come under what the law says. And at this point, because there are no rules put on paper yet for it, we find that it would be very helpful to know how you would like it interpreted and how you see it, because we'd like to see how the community that is going to be subject to it, how you think it should be regulated by the department. So I mean, we're not at that point yet where we're going to be putting something down on paper and saying this is how it's going to be. The main point of the stakeholder meeting is that we'd like to know what your thoughts are on the law and how it should be implemented. I mean, at this point, at least from a rule writer perspective, I would love to see the different perspectives from the community, because we're all subject to that law, and I would like to see the outside the department viewpoints, because I think it's really valuable to see the different perspectives before we put pen to paper.
But I guess my question is, without knowing what this law is trying to avoid happening, it's almost impossible to figure out how to help that be implemented with the common sense side of, hey, listen, we do this every day. Mm-hmm. This is what we see and how you could do it. We don't even know what you're trying to do.
Well, I think from a common sense standpoint, like when I had looked at the law and the statute, the big thing is that they supplemented the A901 law as it existed. So it's just seeing that it's kind of related to what has already been implemented and what already exists. I think maybe from that perspective, again, this is just Judy. This is just Judy from looking at the statute that we all have to deal with. So, if you see it from that same perspective, we'd like to know if you do.
Whoever helped craft the law should be here to tell us what their goal was.
For the record, that was not me.
Yeah, no, I could tell that. Because it seems like what they're trying to do is create LSRPs in the A901 field where all the dirt that moves around the state is now going to be handled or controlled by A901 companies, A901 facilities, which is pretty onerous when most of the dirt that moves around the state is clean. It shouldn't all go into that stream or be handled as if the same way that an LSRP does. So whoever wrote it obviously had a goal. I mean, we can guess at what it is, but we didn't help like that, and whoever did isn't here, so we don't know what the goal is. It's very hard to meet a goal when nobody knows what that goal is.
That's true, and I think that when Ray Cantor had mentioned before that, okay, there's one viewpoint, there's a couple different viewpoints on why this law is there. Me personally, I can't make that decision. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are on it and how you see it impacting what you do.
Yeah, I mean, we're really stuck because we don't know what the goal is, so it's hard for us to kind of help get to that point. Companies that have A901s already that handle dirty dirt, I'm sure would love to have all the dirt moved in the state, funneled through them, that their hands go on it somehow. Mm-hmm. But that's going to get really onerous, expensive, and it's just going to create a black market because they would have to voluntarily get on the radar. Mm-hmm. Dirt could be moving off of a site, but what's that going to look like if there's no, okay, you got to go through this step, go through this step. It's really tough to know where to go without even an arrow pointing in a direction.
Well, and at this point, we're still really early in the stakeholder process. So the hope is that we're going to be able to refine these points as we continue through the process and have more discussions.
Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, Caleb. Next up, Robert Lippincott, do you have something addition or did I miss something?
No, I just wanted to comment on the definition of consultant and just mention I think Caleb brought up some really good points there. I think the department does have an important and a big task here figuring this out. I think on the one end, Ray Cantor's comments were very good actually, and I think my only comment is think about you try not to micromanage the whole system, the whole thing. The idea is to look at the bigger picture of. I think that's a good question, what the objective is, but that's something I think in the bigger picture, we know what the objective is. It's starting to get into where do you draw the lines, and I think that's the challenge. And with regard to these definitions, as somebody astutely pointed out, they do impact this. This isn't just about the recycling aspects. These definitions change in the whole A901 universe, right? So when you talk about things like waste, hazardous waste, and those aspects. I mean, in fact, it doesn't even say liquid or solid, and we're disposing of groundwater in containers to go into a wastewater treatment facility. This definition could include that. It doesn't say, but we haven't even talked about that. So those are the kind of things that create uncertainty for us. That I think it would be good for the department to clarify. Specifically on consultant, I would echo Wolfgang's comments. and I agree. What I would say is, just to cut to the chase here, is think about the definition. Consultant means a person who performs functions for a business concern. Just add the word primarily engaged in, okay? And think about how that focuses this away from maybe the areas that it's not intended and to the areas that it is. Because to me, that's what we're, in a way that we're talking about, that we're dealing with businesses that are primarily engaged in these processes, et cetera. As I mentioned before, like in the term broker, consultant for a business concern engaged in these things can, if I'm working for an entity that's dealing with selling widgets, they're not in the business of transportation, treatment, et cetera, but they have to do remediation. So if they hire someone and move some soils, that's not their business. So I don't know that that's who the state wants to focus this on. And so I think that it would be a consultant for the businesses engaged in those things primarily, not for businesses that are trying to comply with ISRA or another regulation.
Robert, those are good ideas. We're definitely going to take that under advisement. Like we said, we really wanted to talk about this a little bit more. We're going to be carrying this topic to our next episode. For the rest of today,
Thanks for the opportunity.
We have both Jennifer and Tracy up for comments, and I think in the interest of time, we're probably just going to have to stop after Tracy and tie up for the day, but we're definitely going to get back together with this again. With that, Jennifer, would you like to provide your final comments for today?
Sure. I would like to provide some clarification as to the intention of what we're trying to regulate here. So as Mike brought up in the beginning, very accurately, this is a result of the SCI investigation, so and mostly on illegal dumping. So regulated community, Class Bs that are allowed to accept soil, materials that get buds. If you're going to a site that has some oversight, some regulation that's outside of and then for the materials that are outside of solid waste that aren't currently being reported, aren't captured in any mechanism back to DEP, those are the materials that the law is trying to capture, so that there's more accountability, there's tracking, there's the responsibility of management of proper materials, and you don't end up with the illegal piles. So very quickly, just because I don't want to take up a lot of time, it is late, but I think it'll help a lot of people understand what goes on. So, you have all these different folks involved, brokers, salespeople, consultants. They did do this as an amendment to A901 in general, so now it kind of muddies it up because now we have to look at it as solid waste, but we can probably do some special carve-outs in the rule where it clarifies what that means for soil and fill. And then just to clarify the comment beforehand, it definitely does not include liquids because it's just specific to solid soil and fills. If it's not a solid waste and it's outside that definition, it's there's like a small niche amount of material that then people just improperly dispose of. So that's it.
All right, Jennifer, thank you so much for your ideas and the discussion today. We really appreciate it. And now we have Tracy. Welcome back, Tracy. Thanks for hanging out with us this afternoon. Do you have additional comments on the definitions?
I did. Just one is, we're looking at people's primary lines of business, and, like to reiterate what Jennifer said, the goal is to make sure their dirt doesn't go into places it's not supposed to. So you're looking at all of these different definitions and bringing in people that, I guess Mike pointed out what you're worried about if material goes to one site that was, a 901 approved site and it gets rejected and somebody's making a decision. Does it really matter if it's going to another approved licensed 901 site if that person, is a contractor or a consultant that is doing other work on the site and their business is not being a broker? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think you should take a hard look at that, because as long as there's somebody tracking and monitoring it and it's going to be moved by the licensed people, going to a licensed approved facility, do you really need every hand in the middle to have that 901? And that's where I think a lot of the relief would be appreciated by everybody on this phone call, because the consultants don't need it. Wolf didn't need it for his work, and we may all be engaged in it incidentally, but that's not our line of business. It just happens to be something that we're doing. Somebody else is watching, approving, checking the boxes, tracking it. And I think a little bit of relief for all of those entities would go a long way.
And again, I'm going to toss out the general invitation. You know, if there are particular terms that we talked about today that are defined a certain way in the statute, but there might be a way to more narrowly tailor or clarify what you believe the intent of the statute was, we would love it if you would send us some sample language. I mean, you're giving us a lot of ideas to work with and a lot of material to help flush out how we can best bring this statutory language into our regulations. So again, if you get a chance, please email us at the soil and fill email that was in the chat. At this point, I'd like first, on behalf of myself, I'd like to thank you guys for spending the afternoon with us and giving us some great information to work with. With that, I would like to toss it to Anna for our closing remarks.
Thank you, Judy. I promise I won't keep you much longer. So as Judy said, thank you all so very much for participating in our first stakeholder meeting. We got a lot of wonderful information from you all, and reiterating what she said, that I encourage you to email that soil and fill inbox, so that way we can especially capture the language that we're trying to incorporate into our rules. So I just wanted to mention, like I said, thank you so much for coming to this meeting. Summaries of the topics that were covered at the meeting and relevant information will be made available at the website that's included below. Our next stakeholder meeting will be held on January 25th, 2022. It'll also be a Teams meeting. If you would like to participate, feel free to send me an email saying that you would like to. We're going to determine the topics for that discussion, and then hopefully get back to everybody with respect to what we're going to discuss. And then, yes, just please send in any emails with any comments or any feedback that you would like to that email below. But other than that, thank you all for your input, your participation, your patience. We're doing the best that we can with the law, and we appreciate all of your assistance with it. So thank you very much. All right, and you're free to go. So have a good night, everyone.